Hey guys, tonight we're plunging into something a little darker, a little heavier, and a whole lot bloodier than usual. We're heading back to the Middle Ages, a time of castles, crusades, and kings who would rather burn you alive than hear you say the wrong thing. Yeah, this isn't fairy tale royalty, this is worst of the worst territory. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'll be here whispering terrible tales either way, so no pressure. Also, let me know in the comments what city you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. Midnight in Milan? 2 AM in Tokyo? I want to know who's still awake with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes to a world shrouded in smoke, cold stone, and the iron stench of old blood. It's the year 1066, or maybe 1312, or maybe something even more ancient. Time slides like oil in this place. You're surrounded by high walls, flickering torchlight, and a silence that isn't peaceful. It's full of what used to be screams. The Middle Ages weren't always as romantic as we like to pretend. Beneath the stained glass and illuminated manuscripts, there were kings with hearts as hard as their iron crowns, rulers so obsessed with control, vengeance, or survival that cruelty wasn't just a tool, it was their identity. You feel it before you see it, the chill of dread, the sense that somewhere nearby someone has the power to make your life vanish without explanation or trial. Maybe a servant whispered the wrong word, maybe a bishop fell out of favour, maybe you were just there when the king woke up in a bad mood. This was an era when being royal meant being untouchable, unchallengeable, and, if you were particularly unhinged, unspeakably brutal. But here's the thing. Evil in the Middle Ages wasn't as simple as just bad guy does bad things. It was tangled up with religion, legacy, paranoia, and legacy building. You could order a town burned down and still be considered a godly man if you did it in the name of Christ or claimed your enemy was a heretic. You could dismember your own family and blame it on divine will. Your sins didn't stain your soul if they helped solidify your kingdom. And no, you probably wouldn't survive this time period. Even if you avoided the plague, the bandits, the starvation and the wars, you'd still be at risk of some monarch deciding you looked a little too smug for their taste, so buckle in. First, let's talk about how someone becomes this kind of king. It's not always a straight line from cradle to cruelty. Sometimes it starts with a trauma, a violent invasion, a murdered parent, a betrayal by someone trusted. Other times the seeds are sown in excessive privilege, isolation and unchecked power. Imagine a kid who grows up never being told no, surrounded by schemers and sycophants, where every mistake is covered up and every desire indulged. Eventually that kid gets a crown, and what they want is the world, bloody and broken if necessary. You walk past a tapestry showing a smiling king raising a golden goblet. Zoom in and you notice the goblet is filled with blood, and the people at his feet are his own advisors, their heads bowed low, not in loyalty but in fear. That, right there, is your average Tuesday under many of the rulers we'll meet. Some ruled with iron fists, others with poisoned wine, sharpened knives, or just the constant threat of unbearable torture. But not all of them looked evil. That's part of what makes this list so disturbing. Some of these kings were handsome, charming, even generous when it suited them. But when they turned, the mask slipped and what was underneath was monstrous. The court jester might find himself flayed alive for a bad pun. A noble might wake up with his entire estate on fire, his family dragged to the dungeons, and enemy king's sons might simply disappear forever, their screams swallowed up by thick castle walls. Historically speaking, scholars still debate what counts as evil in a time when war crimes weren't really crimes yet. Some historians argue that many of these acts were just standard medieval politics, that burning down a village was a military tactic, not a war crime, that a few well-placed executions were just good governance. That may be true, but when you start adding up the corpses, the betrayals, the tortures that went well beyond what was normal, you start to realise some of these rulers weren't just surviving, they were indulging. And then there's the fringe stuff. Legends, rumours, chroniclers who maybe added a little spice to the truth. You'll hear about a king who fed his enemies to wild animals, or who kept a collection of severed tongues, or who demanded fresh virgin blood to wash his hair. Were they real? Maybe, but even if they weren't, the fact that people believed them says something. It tells you that, true or not, these kings were feared so deeply that horror became part of their mythology. As you step deeper into this timeline, the faces change, but the chill stays the same. One ruler smirks from his golden throne, while a heretic burns at his feet. Another rides into battle with a necklace made of human teeth. One throws lavish feasts as half the kingdom starves, and each one leaves behind a trail of blood-soaked parchment and cracked bones buried beneath palace floors. This journey isn't just a roll call of psychopaths with crowns. It's about the fragile line between leadership and tyranny, between divine right and human ruin. You're going to stand beside kings who crushed cities, butchered rivals, and sometimes even murdered their own children. You're going to feel their breath on the back of your neck, hear the creak of their boots on damp dungeon stairs. So take a breath. That creeping dread you feel, that's the sound of a drawbridge rising behind you. There's no turning back now. You hear the name first, King John, spoken with a hiss, like someone cursing under their breath. It clings to the walls of a stone corridor like mould. Not the noble John of bedtime Bible stories or friendly tavern keepers. No, this is that King John, the one who turned betrayal into an art form, who made enemies faster than he could have them executed. The villain of Robin Hood stories, sure, but also the villain of real-life chronicles. And honestly, the stories don't exaggerate enough. You're standing in the court of England, somewhere in the early 1200s. The throne room is rich. Velvet banners, a scent of wine and wax in the air. But underneath it all is tension. Thick, sticky. Like someone's about to get publicly disemboweled. King John sits on the throne, eyes narrow, lips tight, fingers always twitching like he's thinking about choking someone. Maybe you. Maybe his advisors. He's not just mistrustful. He's paranoid, and not without reason. He's made so many enemies it would take a full scroll just to name the ones who want him dead by breakfast. Let's get something straight. John wasn't supposed to be king. He was the youngest son of Henry II, forever in the shadow of his cooler, tougher brother, Richard the Lionheart. And when Richard went off to fight in the Crusades, John got a taste of power, and never wanted to let go. The second Richard was captured and ransomed, John didn't just sit tight and hold the fort. He tried to usurp the throne. Imagine your sibling goes on a heroic quest, and you immediately start rearranging their room, pawning their stuff and asking your parents if they're dead yet. That's John. When Richard finally died, John grabbed the crown officially, and immediately lost most of his family's holdings in France. Normandy? Gone. Anjou? See ya. The French crown must have laughed themselves into a nosebleed. This wasn't just bad diplomacy, it was astonishingly self-sabotaging. John had a gift for alienating allies and turning friends into mortal enemies. He'd insult nobles, underpay mercenaries, ignore church leaders, and betray everyone in his orbit until no one was left to trust him. And then he'd panic, and lash out, and start the cycle all over again. You're in the Great Hall when he orders the starvation of 22 knights who dared to side with a rebellious noble. They're locked in Corfe Castle, left to rot and die, no food, no trial, just darkness. John's face is unreadable as he signs the order. To him it's strategy. To the rest of the world it's psychopathy. Later, when his barons push back against his heavy-handed rule, he takes their children as hostages, and then reportedly kills them when their fathers rebel. Not publicly, quietly, efficiently, one of those fringe facts history whispers about but can never quite prove. But it feels true, doesn't it? And then there's the church. John managed to get excommunicated, which, if you know medieval politics, is like putting a kick me sign on your own throne. When Pope Innocent III appointed a new Archbishop of Canterbury, John rejected him outright. So the Pope hit back by placing England under interdict. That meant no mass, no sacraments, no religious ceremonies at all. Babies couldn't be baptised. People couldn't be buried on consecrated ground. Imagine the tension. Imagine the fear. All because King John couldn't swallow his pride for 2 minutes. Eventually, John caved to the Pope, but not because he had a change of heart. Nope. He was facing invasion, rebellion, and possibly losing the crown, so he gave England to the Pope as a papal fief. Just signed it over. And in return, protection. Because that's what John was always good at. Cutting deals at the very last moment, after destroying every other option. He was a desperate gambler in a crumbling palace, betting your life, not his. Then came the barons. Oh, the barons had had it. In 1215, they forced him to sign the Magna Carta, one of the most famous documents in history. You've heard of it. It laid down the principle that the king wasn't above the law. Revolutionary, noble, historic. Except John signed it, crossed his fingers behind his back, and then immediately wrote to the Pope to have it annulled. Like a kid promising to behave, then lighting the curtains on fire 5 minutes later. The rebellion that followed was brutal, bloody, and hopelessly chaotic. John marched across England with a fury that had no direction, pillaging towns just to hurt the people who dared to restrain him. Food supplies burned, villages razed. Records say he left the north of England more desolate than the deserts of Africa. His cruelty wasn't just personal anymore, it was national policy. One final bizarre act of fate. You watch John retreating across the Wash, a vast marshy estuary. He's got wagons full of treasure, maybe even the crown jewels themselves. But the tide turns faster than expected. The carts get stuck. The whole load sinks beneath the mud and waves. John escapes, but his treasure, and perhaps the last of his dignity, vanishes forever. That's your quirky detail for tonight. Treasure hunters still go looking for King John's lost royal baggage in those marshes. He dies not long after. Dysentery, they say. A slow, humiliating end. Alone, raving, unloved. There's no great mourning, no royal funeral attended by weeping crowds. Just a hushed sigh of collective relief. The kind of ending that makes you wonder if medieval karma was a real thing. Scholars still debate how evil John truly was. Some say he was just overwhelmed by a crumbling empire and bad luck. Others say he was clever, even reform-minded in some obscure ways. But here's the thing, almost every chronicler from his own time absolutely loathed him. Monks, nobles, even his enemies, they all agreed on one thing. King John wasn't just a bad king, he was a bad man. As you step away from his shadow, you feel something odd, like you've just crawled out of a pit. One down, 24 to go, and believe it or not, this one wasn't even the worst. The wind shifts, the stone beneath your feet feels sharper somehow. You've crossed into darker territory, not just evil for convenience, not just cruelty as policy. No, now you stand before a man who enjoyed it, who wore terror like armour and impalement like a royal signature. You've entered Wallachia, deep in the Carpathian Mountains, and there, looming against the storm-slashed skyline, is Castle Panari, home to one of the most notorious men to ever wear a crown, Vlad the Impaler, also known as Vlad III, also known, if you're into gothic fiction, as Dracula. Let's get something straight from the beginning. Yes, Bram Stoker borrowed his name and vibes, but the real Vlad didn't need fictional flair to be terrifying. He wasn't a vampire, he was worse. He was human. A prince, not a king in the strict Western sense, but he ruled like one. Ruthless, absolute, and soaked into enough blood to make you wish for garlic and crosses instead. You arrive just in time to see a forest of stakes on the outskirts of Targovishte. Hundreds of them, thousands maybe. And on each one, a body, impaled bottom to top, fluttering like grotesque flags in the breeze. Some are already rotting, the air thick with the stench of decay. Others are fresh, their mouths still frozen mid-scream. And Vlad? He walks through them calmly, like he's admiring garden rose. The sight is his warning, his message, his legacy. This is what happens, it says, when you cross me. The year is around 1460. The Ottoman Empire is expanding and Vlad's little corner of Eastern Europe is in its path. But instead of folding, Vlad decides to terrify his enemies into retreat. It's not just about killing, it's how he kills. Impalement, for example, wasn't fast. He made sure of that. He'd have a stake rounded, not sharpened, and lubricated with animal fat so the victim would slide slowly, agonizingly, down the pole for hours, even days. The stake would enter through the rear and, if done just right, emerge near the shoulder without piercing vital organs too quickly. The perfect balance of art and horror. You wonder what could twist a person into this. Vlad's childhood offers some clues. He was held hostage by the Ottomans as a boy, insurance to keep his father in line. During that captivity, he was likely abused, possibly tortured, and certainly forced to live with enemies who would one day try to erase his people. When he returned home, everything he did screamed of overcompensation. He wasn't just defending Wallachia. He was claiming it, owning it, and making it so horrifying to invade that enemies might think twice. Here's a fringe detail you might enjoy, or deeply regret learning. One tale tells of Vlad having a golden goblet placed at a public fountain. Anyone could drink from it, and no one dared steal it. Why? Because theft was punishable by impalement. Not a slap on the wrist, not a night in the stocks. Impaled. Imagine trusting public property so much you could leave solid gold unattended, and know it would still be there in the morning. And it wasn't just criminals or invaders who met that fate. Vlad had a thing about poverty. He once invited hundreds of the region's poor and sick to a grand feast. They came, grateful, hopeful. After the meal, he locked the doors and set the building on fire. All of them died. Why? Because he didn't want beggars in his perfect kingdom. That story might be apocryphal, might be exaggerated, but then again, considering the other things he definitely did, it feels almost too plausible. You meet his enemies next, or at least their ghosts. Hungarian envoys who refused to remove their hats in his presence. Impaled with the hats nailed to their heads. Ottoman messengers who disrespected his court. Executed for the insult. He even launched psychological warfare that would make modern generals jealous. Once he captured thousands of Ottoman soldiers and impaled them just outside his capital, leaving their bodies as a welcome sign for the approaching enemy army. When the Sultan saw it, he reportedly turned around and left. He abandoned the campaign. Because what do you do when your opponent fights with pure terror? Even scholars can't fully agree on Vlad. Romanian historians often portray him as a national hero, a defender of Christendom, a prince who stood up to both the Ottomans and corrupt nobles. Others see him as a genocidal maniac with a flair for theatrical murder. Maybe both are true. The medieval world was messy like that. One man's monster was another man's messiah. You climb the steps to Castle Poenari, 180 of them. Vlad supposedly forced enemy soldiers to build this mountain fortress, working them to death under the threat of impalement. The stairs are slick, narrow, and seem to whisper with every step. At the top, the castle walls stand broken and wild, open to the sky. It's not beautiful. It's harsh, brutal, fitting. This was his sanctuary, his command post, and probably where he imagined a Europe bowed to his will. He didn't live to see that, of course. Eventually betrayed, captured, and imprisoned, Vlad died in battle, or possibly beheaded by his own men. No one knows for sure. His head, they say, was sent to the Sultan in Constantinople, a final gruesome trophy. Still, Vlad's legend wouldn't die with him. Stories spread. Tales of drinking blood, of unholy powers, of a man who couldn't be killed. Centuries later, Bram Stoker caught wind of those whispers and borrowed the name Dracula for his own fictional villain. But in some ways, the real Vlad is scarier. He doesn't need bats or fangs, just a stake, some rope, and a cold sile. You leave Wallachia with the image of the impalement field burned into your memory. This wasn't just a reign of terror. It was a performance, a masterpiece of medieval cruelty. And for Vlad the Impaler, evil wasn't a means to an end. It was the end. The path bends again, and this time, the world feels quieter, eerily so. There's no screaming, no burning, no forest of corpses on display, but somehow it's worse. The silence is heavy, like the hush before a thunderstorm, or the pause after someone says something unforgivable. You're in medieval France now, the 1390s, creeping your way into the crumbling candle-lit corridors of a royal palace. A door swings open, and you step into a room that feels strangely padded, furniture bolted to the floor, no mirrors, a few guards who never blink, and there, sitting in a robe stitched with gold and filth, muttering to himself in a voice dry with dust, is Charles VI of France, known to some as Charles the Mad. This king didn't rule with iron or flame. He ruled with delusion, hallucination, and the kind of unpredictable mental unravelling that left a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse. His madness wasn't a private affair. It leaked into statecraft, into warfare, into the way he treated his family, his enemies, and his people. And the worst part? No one could stop him, because what do you do when your king starts believing he's made of glass? You heard that right. At one point, Charles was so deep into a psychotic episode that he believed his body was fragile, literally made of glass. He ordered his clothes reinforced to protect his delicate shell. He refused to let anyone touch him, and when someone got too close, he panicked, screamed, wept. Imagine trying to govern a nation on the brink of English invasion while your king is hiding in a corner, begging not to be shattered. But it didn't start that way. Charles was young, handsome, and full of potential when he first took the throne at just 11 years old. For a while he was seen as a golden hope, and especially after the disasters of his father's reign. France had been battered by war, famine, and plague, and here was a fresh start, a new monarch to steer the ship. But things went sour early. A string of bad decisions, shady advisors, and family infighting wore him down fast. And then came the episode. It was 1392. Charles had just set out to punish a rebellious duke. The sun was hot. The ride was long. Suddenly something snapped. A servant dropped a lance, a noise rang out, and Charles went berserk. He drew his sword and attacked his own men. Slaughtered one, injured others, raged like a demon. When it ended, he collapsed unconscious. And when he woke, he wasn't the same. That was the first of many attacks. Over the years, they came more frequently. Periods of paranoia, memory loss, violence, even catatonia. He'd forget who he was, forget who his wife was, forget he was king at all. Other times, he believed he was being hunted, poisoned, or cursed. And the court, powerless. The nobles fought each other, the queen tiptoed, and the people lost faith as the country teetered between instability and outright collapse. Your quirky fact tonight is one of medieval fashion meets delusion. During his glass body phase, Charles reportedly wore iron rods sewn into his clothes to keep his limbs from breaking. Tailors had to specially craft garments that looked royal but functioned like a medieval exosuit. No, he wasn't parading around in full armour. He still wanted to look kingly. But beneath the velvet, steel reinforcement. Form met madness in a way that no therapist could begin to untangle. Meanwhile, France was suffering. The 100 Years' War raged on. English armies advanced. The infamous Battle of Agincourt, where France was humiliated, happened on Charles's watch, though he was too deep in his mental haze to grasp it. Rival factions of nobles took advantage of his episodes to grab power, especially his brother Louis of Orleans and cousin John the Fearless. Their feuding spiralled into a brutal civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. All of this while the king sat in rooms darkened by order, muttering to the walls. Some historians argue Charles was schizophrenic. Others say bipolar, or possibly afflicted by hereditary madness brought on by generations of royal inbreeding. There's no clear consensus. Medieval medicine, after all, didn't exactly distinguish between psychosis and demonic possession. And let's be real, when a ruler's behaviour becomes this erratic, people stop asking medical questions and start grabbing for swords. One moment, he'd be lucid, briefly charming, issuing orders, making sense, and then suddenly, the fog would roll back in. He'd wander the halls screaming, refuse to bathe or eat. At one point, he supposedly ran howling through the palace for hours, convinced he was being devoured by invisible enemies. People around him began to treat the king like a living relic, dangerous, sacred, broken. Even more disturbing, he fathered children during these years. His wife Isabeau of Bavaria stayed by his side, publicly loyal, though increasingly involved in politics behind the scenes. There were rumours, of course, affairs, manipulations. Who could blame her? She was essentially married to a ghost with a crown, and someone had to keep the throne from toppling completely. Despite it all, Charles reigned for 42 years. That's the part that's hardest to grasp. His mind was shattering, his court was crumbling, and France was slipping into war and occupation. But the man on the throne remained the same. That's not just a failure of momentum, of medicine. That's the medieval monarchy laid bare. No matter how sick, how unstable, how dangerous the king became, he stayed king, because God said so. In the end, he died quietly in 1422, a shadow of the man he once was. France, meanwhile, was in shambles. The crown passed to his son Charles VII, though not without a mess of conflict and claims, and even now, centuries later, the debate continues. Was Charles the Mad simply a man crushed by a brutal world and with bad genes, or a victim of a crown too heavy for anyone sane to wear? You leave the cold, soft-padded chamber behind and step back into the wind. This was a different kind of evil, not violent like Vlad, not petty and cruel like King John, but a slow rot, a royal mind collapsing inward, while everything outside burns. And honestly, in some ways, it's more haunting than all the others. The sky darkens and the ground underfoot hardens like something's changing. Not just the weather, but the mood. The chill here isn't wind, it's instinct telling you to turn around. But you don't. You can't. Ahead lies a boy, alone in a crumbling Russian palace, staring out a frostbitten window with eyes far too empty for someone his age. His name is Ivan, and one day he will be called the Terrible, but tonight you meet him before the title, before the crown, while the cruelty is still growing like mould in his soul. It's the early 1530s, and Ivan IV is just a child, but already he's surrounded by treachery, betrayal, and an absence of anything resembling love. His father, Grand Prince Vasily III, dies when Ivan is only 3. His mother, Elena Glinskaya, takes over as regent, and then she dies suddenly, poisoned most likely when Ivan is 8. And just like that, he becomes a royal orphan, tossed like a half-forgotten chess piece into the hands of greedy boyars, Russia's noble class, who care more about power than parenting. You watch as he's ignored, mocked, and humiliated by the very people meant to protect him. They withhold food to keep him humble, beat him to teach obedience. He wanders the massive, freezing halls of the Kremlin, dressed in silks that do nothing against the cold, picking scraps from servants' plates. He sees dogs starve and die, sees people murdered and buried without ceremony, and instead of looking away, he watches, learns. There's a story, a creepy little nugget tucked into early accounts, that Ivan would throw live animals from the Kremlin walls just to hear the sounds they made when they hit the stones below. Dogs, cats, birds. He didn't cry, didn't blink, just leaned over and watched them splatter. Maybe he was experimenting with power. Maybe he was trying to make someone, anything, feel as helpless as he did. Or maybe it just felt good. This isn't a story about a king gone mad overnight. This is a slow burn. Ivan's cruelty brews in silence, tucked behind those cold blue eyes, as the years pass. He's coronated at age 16, and unlike his predecessors, he doesn't settle for the title of Grand Prince. He demands something grander. Tsar, Emperor, God's anointed, a word thick with ambition and absolute authority. When the crown touches his head in 1547, something in him cracks open, and he smiles. At first, he surprises everyone. He marries Anastasia Romanovna, a calm and stabilizing influence. He reforms the legal code, reorganizes the military, even sets up the beginnings of Russia's postal system. For a moment, you almost think, maybe he turned out okay. But no, this is just Act 1. You're not even close to the horror show. The turning point comes in 1560, when Anastasia suddenly dies. Poisoned, Ivan believes. Probably by the boyars again. Her death guts him, unhinges him. He rages through the palace, accusing everyone of treason, betrayal, witchcraft. He turns against the very nobles he once courted. Some historians argue Anastasia's death was the moment Ivan lost whatever shred of empathy he still had. Others think it just gave him an excuse to do what he'd always wanted to do, rule through fear. You blink, and suddenly you're walking through the nightmare that follows, the Oprichnina. Ivan's personal reign of terror. He divides the country in two, one half under standard administration, the other under his direct, brutal control. He creates a secret police force, the Oprichniki, who wear black robes and ride black horses, with severed dog heads strapped to their saddles, meant to symbolize their duty to sniff out treason and bite the enemies of the Tsar. You see one now, riding past with eyes like burnt coal, blood dripping from his gloves. The Oprichniki torture, mutilate, burn entire villages, and all in Ivan's name. One by one, the boyars who tormented him as a child are arrested, publicly humiliated, and then executed, sometimes by boiling, sometimes by beheading, sometimes by being sewn into bearskins and torn apart by dogs. It's not just vengeance, it's theatre. Ivan wants his enemies to suffer, yes, but more than that, he wants the rest of the country to watch. Your fringe detail for the night. Ivan once forced a noble to watch his own wife being raped, then had her executed anyway. That story doesn't make it into the school books. It should. It shows exactly what Ivan's justice looked like. Not a sword, but a slow, rotting disease. He didn't just punish betrayal. He imagined betrayal, invented it, and then punished you for it anyway. But the moment everyone remembers, everyone talks about, is the death of his own son. The heir, also named Ivan, had argued with his father after Ivan beat his pregnant daughter-in-law for wearing immodest clothing. The son yelled. The father, raging, wild-eyed, struck him with a staff. The blow crushed the young man's skull. Ivan the Terrible cradled his son's body as he died, sobbing, panicked. It's the one glimpse we get of a soul still in there, but it came too late. There's a famous painting, Ivan the Terrible and his son on November 16th, 1581. You've probably seen it. Ivan's face haunted and wide-eyed, his hands drenched in blood, his dead son limp in his lap. It's fiction, of course. The moment as painted never happened exactly that way. But it feels true, and that's what matters. By the time Ivan died in 1584, he'd alienated his court, bankrupted his nation, and reduced vast parts of Russia to ash and ruins. And still some Russians revere him. Say he was tough, yes, but necessary. That he expanded the empire, that he kept order. It's a debate that never quite dies. Scholars argue about whether he was paranoid schizophrenic, a victim of childhood trauma, or just a sadist with too much power. And honestly, does it matter? Whether Ivan was mad or merely monstrous, the outcome was the same. An empire soaked in blood and ruled by terror. You walk away from Ivan's shadow with a hollow ache behind your eyes, because unlike Vlad, whose violence was external, Ivan turned it inward, carved it into his own family, his soul, his legacy. And you know this. When we reach the truly terrible kings of history, the worst monsters aren't the ones who laugh while killing. It's the ones who cry afterward and still keep killing anyway. You come out of Ivan's frigid, blood-soaked Russia expecting a break, maybe some dusty old king obsessed with tax codes and royal ceremonies. But no, not here, not tonight. Now you're entering France again, and things are about to get strategic, cold, clinical. This isn't madness or childhood trauma driving cruelty. This is deliberate evil, structured, calculated, almost boring in its precision. And somehow that makes it worse. Meet Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair, though fair here doesn't mean just or kind, it means blonde. You're in the early 1300s now, and France is growing, wealthy, powerful, dangerously ambitious. Philip is tall, elegant, and has the blank stare of someone who already decided your fate 10 minutes ago, and is just waiting for you to realise it. He doesn't shout, he doesn't rage, he simply acts. And if that act happens to involve you being tortured in a dungeon for 5 years while your assets are redistributed to the crown, well, c'est la vie. Your first sign of trouble? The coinage. Philip starts fiddling with the French currency early in his reign, debasing the silver content while keeping the face value the same. It's brilliant. He makes money appear to multiply without actually increasing the kingdom's wealth. Problem is, the people catch on, prices skyrocket, bread becomes a luxury, riots erupt. And to Philip, he crushes them with brutal efficiency, then pretends it never happened. A temporary setback, he calls it. In reality, it's a preview of what's to come. Next, he sets his eyes on the Knights Templar, those famous Crusader knights turned banker warriors. Once heroes of Christendom, now keepers of one of Europe's largest treasuries. And that's a problem for Philip, because his government is bleeding gold like a wounded ox. Wars, debt, his expensive rivalry with England. So he looks at the Templars and sees not holy men, but an ATM guarded by old warriors in white robes. So in 1307, on Friday the 13th, yes, that Friday the 13th, Philip strikes. You're in Paris when it happens. Templar headquarters are raided simultaneously across France. Hundreds of knights are arrested, imprisoned and tortured. You hear screaming echo through the stone corridors, echoing across the Seine. Teeth pulled, bones broken, feet crushed. Under torment, some confess to things no sane person believes. Worshipping idols, kissing each other's backsides and spitting on the cross, committing all manner of heresy. It's a pageant of confessions extracted with hot irons and cold threats. Philip doesn't care if they're true. He just needs something, anything to justify seizing Templar property. He gets it. And then he gets the Pope to go along with it. That's another thing about Philip. He didn't just bully knights, he bullied the papacy. When Pope Boniface VIII tried to rein him in, lecturing him on morality, threatening to excommunicate him, Philip responded by calling a council to accuse the Pope of sorcery and sodomy. Then he sent troops to attack Boniface at Anagni in 1303. They beat him so badly he died shortly after. Yes, Philip the Fair literally beat a pope to death by proxy. The next pope? Conveniently French, then the one after that, still French. Philip basically relocates the entire papacy to Avignon, kicking off what historians call the Avignon papacy, or the Babylonian captivity of the church. The Pope, in theory, is the supreme spiritual authority of Christendom. In practice, He's now living in France under the thumb of a king who doesn't blink at burning people alive for a better fiscal quarter. Back to the Templars. Their Grand Master Jacques de Molay holds out the longest. For years he denies the charges. You see him shackled, skeletal, dragged into courtroom after courtroom, refusing to break. Finally, in 1314, Philip loses patience. He orders Molay and a fellow Templar leader to be burned alive on an island in the Seine. No trial, no delay, just torches and silence. As the flames rise, Molay shouts a curse. Not a whisper. A curse! He calls out Philip and Pope Clement, demanding they both meet him before God within the year. And here's your fringe fact, they do. Clement dies a month later. Philip just 7 months after that. Sudden, painful, unexplainable deaths. Superstition, coincidence, or a curse that actually stuck. You feel a ripple of unease just thinking about it. For all his cold logic, Philip dies like a man whose strings were finally cut. Historians still wrestle with Philip's legacy. Some call him a legal reformer, a fiscal innovator, the architect of modern statecraft. And yes, he did strengthen royal authority, streamlined administration, even helped define the early structure of what we now call a nation-state. But he also destroyed entire institutions for convenience. He weaponized the courts, turned confessions into political currency. He didn't slaughter out of rage, he slaughtered out of necessity. There's a special kind of chill in that, isn't there? Vlad and Ivan at least felt something while they ruled, anger, grief, fear, but Philip? It's hard to know if he felt anything at all. He was methodical, detached, surgical. When he wanted something, wealth, power, obedience, he didn't negotiate. He calculated, and when the numbers didn't work out, he removed variables. The Templars were just one variable. You step away from the glowing embers of Jacques de Molay, his silhouette frozen in your mind. It's quiet again, not because the violence has ended, but because the violence was never loud in Philip's world. Just a signature on a scroll, just a sentence whispered to a torturer. Just a Friday morning that turned unlucky for everyone but the king. You wake up to music. Not the good kind, the royal court kind, flutes and lutes and someone overplaying a harp. You're in Castile now, early 1400s, a sunny patch of Spain wrapped in intrigue, ambition, and the faint perfume of betrayal. You're standing at the court of John Mid of Castile, and for a second you think maybe this one isn't going to be so bad. The man himself doesn't scream evil. He's not blood-soaked or hollow-eyed. He's delicate, even poetic. Literally, he writes poetry. You see him now, scribbling verse in gold ink, while war drums rumble not far beyond the castle gates. But don't let the soft edges fool you. John II's cruelty isn't painted in broad strokes, it's subtle, indirect, like a knife slipped between ribs during a dance. He's the kind of king who doesn't need to get his hands dirty because he's already surrounded himself with people who love doing it for him. And there's one man in particular who does that job very, very well. Álvaro de Luna, the king's favourite. You've probably never heard of Álvaro unless you've dug deep into Spanish royal history, but he's the star of this era. John is more of a shadow in his own reign, a puppet in expensive shoes. From the moment they meet, Álvaro wraps himself around the king's mind like ivy, slowly choking every other voice out of the court. And John? He likes it. He needs it. He's indecisive, anxious, constantly under pressure from squabbling nobles, and Álvaro is smooth, brilliant, and ruthless. You see it start small. An insult. A sideways glance. And then suddenly someone's castle is seized. Another noble is invited. To court and never comes back. Whispers in the halls grow teeth. The court becomes a maze of traps, each one baited with a favour, a promotion, or a lie. Álvaro handles the logistics. John signs the orders. A perfect little system of plausible deniability. The body count starts to rise, but quietly. One story that gets whispered in the tapestries. A noble accuses Álvaro of corruption. Within days, that noble is arrested and executed for treason. The trial lasts an hour. No defence, no witnesses, just a convenient scroll signed in John's hand and a sudden lack of oxygen in the courtroom. The king doesn't even attend. He's busy editing a poem about the virtues of silence. You have to wonder if that was an irony or if he really didn't get it. John II rules from 1406 to 1454, a long time by any standard. And yet historians struggle to describe his policies or achievements. Why? Because he barely had any. Álvaro ran the country, and John, like a bored god, let him. He was obsessed with appearances, tournaments, banquets, the arts, performances. You attend one. It's glorious, jesters, jewels, dancing girls from Granada. And somewhere in the middle of the pageantry, someone is poisoned. Maybe a rival courtier. Maybe just someone who knew too much. No one stops the music. Your fringe fact tonight. John the Sixth once constructed an entire wooden fortress as part of a festival. A fake castle filled with soldiers, dancers and live animals, just to stage a dramatic siege for entertainment. While the real kingdom strained under war and debt, the king was busy directing prop comedy. You wonder how many starving peasants could have eaten off the budget for fake battlements. But the game can't go on forever. Eventually even the most charmed favourites fall. The nobles grow sick of Alvaro. They pressure the king, they threaten revolt. And in 1453, after decades of loyalty, manipulation and backstage executions, John finally does the unthinkable. He turns on Alvaro de Luna. You're there when it happens, in a flickering hall thick with the smell of melted wax and quiet panic. Alvaro is arrested, tried for treason, found guilty of course. The whole thing reeks of political theatre. Flimsy charges, forced testimonies, no real chance of survival. And when he's finally marched to the scaffold, John is nowhere to be seen. Some say he wept in private. Others say he barely reacted. A few even claim he felt relieved, as if slitting the throat of his own shadow somehow freed him. You might think this is John's redemption arc. Nope. Less than a year later, he dies. Some say of illness, others say of guilt. Whatever the case, he leaves behind a fractured kingdom, a disillusioned court and a son, Henry IV of Castile, who will have his own collection of royal problems. But more on that later. What's fascinating about John II is that he didn't have to be cruel. He didn't wake up here twisted like Vlad or slip into madness like Charles VI. But his passivity, his just in the face of injustice, enabled cruelty on a scale just as damaging. His court was a playground for political sadists, his throne a stage for vendettas, and his crown just heavy enough to keep him too distracted to stop it. Historians argue over whether John was weak or just overwhelmed. Maybe he truly thought Alvaro was acting in the kingdom's best interest. Maybe he just didn't care. Or maybe, in a very medieval way, he believed that cruelty by proxy was still righteous, as long as it came with poetry and incense. That's the debate. Is a king responsible for the evil he doesn't commit, but allows? If he signs the paper but closes his eyes? As you leave Castile, the music fades behind you. So does the applause. The court is gone, the players vanished, the castle quiet again. But you can't shake the feeling that John's brand of evil is more common than we'd like to admit. The kind that doesn't need to scream or sharpen blades. Just the kind that watches, waits, and writes poetry while the wolves circle. You're still in Castile, but the air feels heavier now, more charged. The velvet gloves are off. Whatever shadow games John II was playing have evolved into something much bloodier under his successor. This time you're not meeting a puppet with a ruthless advisor. You're meeting a king who does his own stabbing. Peter of Castile, known to history as Pedro el Cruel, or if you ask his fans, Pedro the Just. Yeah, that says a lot right there. It's the mid-14th century. Spain is a chessboard of Christian and Muslim kingdoms, tangled dynasties, and nobles who change loyalties faster than a cat changes sleeping positions. Into this walks Peter, a tall, sharp-featured young man with dark eyes and a mean streak you can feel before he even speaks. He becomes king at 15, just a kid, but with the authority to burn a man alive if he doesn't like the way he bows. He doesn't hesitate. At first, the nobility assumes they'll have an easy time controlling him. He's young, untested. They're wrong. Peter makes quick work of showing everyone who's in charge, and if he can't win your loyalty, he'll settle for your land or your head. He starts by purging the court. Anyone who speaks out of turn ends up mysteriously ill, disappeared or found at the bottom of a river. That includes extended family. He kills several of his half-brothers and cousins, sometimes personally and always without trial. He doesn't bother with subtlety. When a noble plots against him, Peter doesn't send a messenger. He rides out, swords drawn, and solves the problem himself. You hear about a woman, Doña Blanca, his lawful wife. Their marriage was a political move, arranged to tie Castile to another powerful house, but Peter never wanted her. He keeps her locked away in a fortress, alone, essentially imprisoned for years while he publicly flaunts his mistress, Maria de Padilla. Eventually he orders Doña Blanca's death. Some say poison. Others claim she was strangled with a silk cord. Either way, she disappears, and no one dares question it. Peter isn't interested in diplomacy, he's interested in dominance. Then there's the nobleman Fadrique Alfonso, Peter's own half-brother. Fadrique is charismatic, well-loved, and, unfortunately for him, a bit too popular with the military. Peter invites him to the Alcazar in Seville under the pretense of friendship. The hall is quiet. You can hear your own breath as Fadrique enters. Peter greets him warmly, clasps his hands, and then stabs him in the gut right there on the palace floor. His guards rush in and finish the job. Peter wipes the blood off his sleeves and walks away without a word. Classic. Your fringe fact tonight. Peter once forced a noblewoman to dine beside her father's severed head, which he had served to her on a silver platter. No trial, no explanation, just bon appetit. That's not royal justice, that's a horror movie. And for Peter it was Tuesday. Yet weirdly, the common people kind of liked him. Or at least some of them did. Unlike many kings, Peter cracked down hard on aristocratic corruption. He punished tax collectors who extorted peasants. He protected Jewish communities from pogroms, something almost unheard of at the time. He was cruel, yes, but not randomly. He was selective, strategic. For his enemies, he was a nightmare. For others, he was fair, brutally fair maybe. Like a guillotine with good intentions, still the enemies kept coming, and eventually they found a champion, his illegitimate half-brother, Henry of Trastamara. Henry hated Peter, claimed he was illegitimate, unholy, and mentally unstable. More importantly, Henry had support from the nobility, the church, and foreign powers like France. A full-blown civil war erupts, dragging Castile into chaos. You're in the thick of it, watching brother fight brother in a war that makes no room for mercy. Cities burn, thousands die. At one point, Peter allies with England, even striking up an odd friendship with the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock. That gets him back on the throne briefly, but nothing sticks in this war. The crown passes back and forth like a cursed relic. And then the end comes. 1369, Montiel. Peter is cornered in a castle, negotiating terms with what he thinks are neutral parties. It's a trap. Henry is waiting. They drag Peter from his tent. There's no trial, just a brawl. Both brothers roll on the ground, daggers drawn, until Henry drives a blade into Peter's chest. Multiple times. Up close. Personal. No guards, no army, just a fratricide to end a war. When Peter's body is rolled into the courtyard, few mourn him, but many fear him still. Some say he cursed Henry with his dying breath, some say he died laughing. And in a twist of medieval irony, Henry, the man who denounced Peter as a tyrant, goes on to rule with nearly as much brutality. So what do historians make of Peter the Cruel? It's complicated. Spanish chroniclers of the time were mostly aligned with the Trastamara faction, Henry's side, which means their accounts are drenched in bias. Some modern scholars argue Peter was defamed after death, that he was strict, not cruel. Others say, nah, he was just a medieval maniac who happened to like poetry and fair taxation. But that's the thing with kings like Peter. He wasn't universally evil. He wasn't Vlad sharpening stakes in his basement. He loved. He protected selectively. His cruelty wasn't chaotic. It was tactical, calculated. If you were in his favour, you lived well. If not, well, let's hope you enjoyed your last meal. You leave Castile with your head spinning. Another tyrant, another pile of contradictions. Peter ruled like a man who believed the crown was a sword and everyone else was either a shield or a target. And in that mess you glimpse something unsettling. Cruelty doesn't always snarl. Sometimes it smiles, says, I'm doing this for your own good, and then twists the blade anyway. You shift east again, drifting through the Alps into northern Italy, where the sun shines warm on whitewashed villas and the scent of rosemary drifts through the air. It feels peaceful at first. You pass vineyards and bell towers, tiny medieval towns nestled in the hills like pearls. But don't get comfortable, because beneath this postcard landscape lies a horror show even other medieval rulers whispered about. You've come to meet Ezzelino da Romano, a name that rang out like a curse across 13th century Italy. A nobleman by birth, a warlord by ambition, and a tyrant so savage that chroniclers called him the son of the devil without a hint of exaggeration. You arrive in the Veneto region around the year 1250, and everyone's on edge. Not because of plague or famine, or even the usual political squabbles, but because Ezzelino's army is nearby. And when he shows up, the earth doesn't just tremble, it screams. Towns bolt their gates, priests hide relics, families abandon homes overnight and flee into the mountains. Because if he sets foot in your city, it doesn't matter who you are. Merchant, monk, mayor, you are fair game. Ezzelino isn't a king in the traditional sense. He's a podestar. Basically, a city-state overlord in the chaotic patchwork that was medieval Italy. But he holds power like an emperor, and uses it like a sociopath with a grudge. He's technically a vassal of the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick III, and he claims to rule in the emperor's name. But in truth, Ezzelino rules for himself. And when he captures a town, he doesn't just take the city walls, he takes everything, pride, freedom, family, and grinds it under his heel. One of the first things he does after a conquest? Execute the entire ruling class. No exceptions. Judges, nobles, city council members, tied together, marched into the square, and either beheaded or burned alive. Then he turns to the merchants, the artisans, the teachers. He doesn't just kill his enemies, he erases them, sterilizes their bloodlines from the map. In one infamous episode in the town of Verona, Ezzelino reportedly imprisoned over 11,000 citizens, men, women and children, in a single fortified castle. The locals call it a mass burial site with a roof. Some of them starved to death, some were tortured, some were fed to dogs. There are letters from nearby cities begging the Pope to intervene, not politically, but spiritually, to exorcise whatever darkness has possessed this man. That's your fringe fact tonight. An actual papal bull declared Ezzelino to be a literal servant of Satan. Not metaphorically, not figuratively. The church labelled him a demon in human form. And for once, it wasn't hyperbole. You walk with him through a campaign in the city of Padua. The gates fall, the defenders are executed. The survivors, anyone who held a sword or even looked like they could hold one, are tortured until they name others. Then they're tortured. Ezzelino creates a chain of fear so long it stretches into the countryside. Fields go untended. Entire villages flee before he even arrives. Because everyone knows, if he gets close enough to see your house, it's already too late. He rides a black horse, always. Dressed in dark armour, always. Some claim he never smiles. Others say he smiles only when he's ordering a massacre. His brother Alberico serves him loyally, but the rest of his family? Scattered or killed, including his own daughter, who dies mysteriously after angering him. Some say he ordered her execution personally, no trial, no mourning. By 1259, his enemies finally unite. A coalition of city-states, angry nobles, desperate bishops. Even the Pope throws his weight in, offering full crusader privileges to anyone willing to bring this man down. A crusade launched not against heretics or infidels, but against a fellow Christian nobleman. That should tell you something. The decisive battle happens at Cassano d'Adda. You watch him fight, still fierce, still terrifying, but this time his forces are overwhelmed. He's wounded, captured. His enemies want revenge, but they also want him to suffer. They drag him to Soncino and toss him in a dungeon, broken and bloodied. And there in the dark he finally dies. Not from wounds, but from neglect. He refuses food, refuses help, just lies in the corner, festering. Some say it was suicide, others say he was poisoned. Either way, the world breathes again. When word of his death spreads, bells ring across northern Italy. Streets fill with cheering. A literal thanksgiving is held, because the nightmare is over. At least this one. And yet, scholars still debate him. A few argue Ezzelino was simply a product of brutal politics, that his actions, while extreme, helped centralise power in a region divided by petty wars, that he was effective if unhinged. But that's a hard sell when you're standing in the ruins of a prison that once held thousands of innocent families, or staring at mass graves dug with methodical cruelty. Ezzelino da Romano was a one-man apocalypse, not driven by madness, not pushed by trauma, just hungry for control, obedience, silence. He didn't want loyalty, he wanted fear. You leave the Veneto with the taste of ash in your mouth, and the creeping suspicion that the scariest rulers aren't the ones who act out of rage, but the ones who act with perfect brutal clarity. The light dims as you drift east again, away from the sunlit horror of Italy, across the Balkans and toward the old, aching skeleton of what's left of the Byzantine Empire. It's the late 7th century now, and the land is crumbling, besieged from without, rotting from within. You can feel it in the dust, in the sea sagging marble of Constantinople's palaces, in the sharp, bitter tone of the people's whispers. There's a name they spit out like spoiled wine. Justinian II. A name that once shone with the golden weight of empire, but now feels cursed. Because this guy, he's not just evil, he's unkillable, and somehow that makes it worse. You arrive just in time for his first reign, yes, first. Because Justinian doesn't just take the throne once, he does it twice, like a horror movie villain crawling back after you've already buried him. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. His first term starts in 685 CE, when he's in his teens, young, idealistic, and way too eager to be a second coming of his namesake, Justinian the Great, who built Hagia Sophia and gave the empire its grand legal code. This Justinian, he's got the ambition, but instead of law and architecture, his specialties are tax hikes, purges, and straight-up facial mutilation. At first, people are hopeful. He negotiates a temporary peace with the Arabs, reorganises the coinage, even promotes Greek culture across the empire. But there's a problem. Justinian doesn't like disagreement, doesn't tolerate it. Disagree with him once and you might lose your job. Twice, you lose your tongue. Keep talking, you might just lose your head, or your entire city. He leans hard into imperial authority, reinstating harsh laws and squeezing the provinces dry with taxes. The rich hate him, the poor fear him. The church feels played, especially when he starts leaning into heresies one minute and persecuting them the next. No one can tell what he really believes, except this. He believes he is divinely chosen, which, in Byzantine political terms, is code for run. Rebellions start to simmer. Justinian responds with his signature approach, scorched earth punishments. After a revolt in Armenia, he allegedly had the nobles scalped alive. That's your fringe fact for tonight. Yes, scalping, not exactly common practice in Byzantine statecraft. His message was clear: oppose me and I'll make an example of you that your grandchildren will still have nightmares about. But even an emperor can't alienate everyone. Eventually, the backlash erupts. In 695, a group of senators, generals, and bureaucrats has had enough. They storm the palace, drag Justinian from his throne, and hand him over to a group of soldiers. His punishment? They don't kill him. That would be too merciful. Instead, they slice off his nose, a practice known as rhinocopia, because under Byzantine law, a disfigured man can't rule. It should have ended there. You should be watching him bleed out in some dusty exile. But Justinian isn't normal. He escapes, flees to the Khazars, a semi-nomadic people on the edge of the Black Sea. Somehow he marries the Kagan's sister. Somehow he plots revenge. Somehow, after years in exile, he finds supporters willing to risk everything for his return. In 705, a decade after being mutilated and dethroned, Justinian storms Constantinople in the middle of the night, entering through an aqueduct with a band of warriors. Like some undead emperor rising from the sewer, he claims his throne and immediately begins settling scores. One of his first acts is to hunt down his usurper, Leontios, and the man who replaced Leontios, Tiberius III. He doesn't execute them in secret. He parades them through the hippodrome, publicly humiliated, shackled, and then has them executed in front of the crowd, as if to say, I'm back and no one's safe. And from there, the vengeance doesn't stop. He launches a second wave of purges that makes the first look like a warm-up. Anyone even suspected of supporting the previous regime is imprisoned, tortured, exiled, or killed. Entire families vanish. Bureaucrats disappear. The army groans under renewed pressure. One historian calls it a reign of calculated vengeance. You stand in the back of a torchlit chamber, watching Justinian review lists of names with a half smile. It's not a purge, it's bookkeeping. But the empire is done with him. Even the people who once feared him now loathe him. His second reign is shorter, more chaotic, and even more paranoid than the first. His foreign policy collapses. He picks fights with the Bulgars, the Arabs, the Pope, basically everyone. He trusts. No one. Sleeps in different rooms every night. Rewrites laws to give himself more control. He's a king who already lost his face and now he's losing his mind. In 711, another revolt breaks out. This time led by a general named Philippikos Bardanes. Justinian flees again, this time with his young son Tiberios in tow. You watch as they board a ship trying to outrun betrayal, blood, and fate. But it's too late. They're captured before they can escape the Bosphorus. This time there's no exile. Justinian is beheaded, his body discarded like trash. His son is killed days later. No last words, no tomb, just silence. And then, like flipping a coin, the empire pretends he never happened. Portraits are scraped off walls. Coins are melted down. Chronicles suddenly skip whole years. Because what do you do with a man who came back from the dead just to ruin everything all over again? Scholars still don't know what to make of him. Was he a visionary, a tragic figure consumed by power? A misunderstood reformer? A psychotic despot with a resurrection complex? Maybe all of the above? What's certain is this. Justinian II is the only Byzantine emperor to be deposed, mutilated, exiled, and then come back to rule again. That's not resilience. That's obsession. That's a vendetta stretched across a decade and an entire empire. You leave Constantinople with a shiver, because there's something extra terrifying about evil that won't stay dead. Justinian's face may have been broken, but his grip was iron. And even now, the aqueducts still whisper his name. The wind sharpens as you cross the Baltic Sea, and everything feels colder, not just in temperature, but in spirit. Grey skies, grey waters, grey cities lined with people who have had enough of royal nonsense to last 10 lifetimes. You've arrived in Denmark, somewhere in the mid to late 1400s, and you're here to meet Christian Pirce, a man who may not be the most notorious tyrant on this list, but make no mistake, he earns his seat at the table of medieval malevolence. Because Christian's evil isn't flashy or theatrical, it's slow, systemic, a chokehold disguised as fiscal responsibility. He doesn't kill for pleasure. He just squeezes until you suffocate, then asks why you aren't clapping. Christian isn't even Danish by birth. He's a German noble, plucked from obscurity and handed a crown by Danish nobles who thought they could control him. They were wrong. The moment he's crowned in 1448, Christian starts scheming, not loudly, not publicly, but with all the quiet persistence of mould growing behind a throne room tapestry. Your first sign that something's off? The money. Christian is obsessed with it. Not just having it, but taking it from everywhere, everyone, by any means necessary. He raises taxes on nobles, merchants, farmers, and especially on the Hanseatic League, a powerful German trade network that controlled much of the region's economy. Christian doesn't just tax them, he taunts them, blocks ports, seizes cargo, arrests their envoys. He treats one of the most influential economic bodies in Europe like a piggy bank he can kick over whenever he's low on coin. And what does he spend it on? A disastrous war with Sweden, naturally. You watch him try to hold the Kalmar Union, the fragile alliance of Denmark, Sweden and Norway, together through brute force and financial strangulation. The Swedes push back. Hard. Rebellions break out. Uprisings swell in the cities, but Christian doesn't listen. He doubles down, drafts more soldiers, raises more taxes. He invades, and loses, and invades again, and loses again. By now, peasants in Denmark are beyond angry. They're desperate. Christian imposes what's essentially a medieval property tax. You're taxed for your house, your barn, your fields, your tools. You're even taxed for your windows. That's your quirky fact tonight. Christian I is credited with creating one of the earliest versions of the window tax, a charming little way to bleed your citizens while pretending to improve urban planning. People start bricking up their windows to avoid it, plunging their homes into darkness. It's not just about money, it's humiliation. But Christian isn't finished. He institutes something called the Sound Dues, tolls on ships passing through the Øresund Strait, which links the North Sea to the Baltic. It's a smart move. Geographically, it's a gold mine. But politically, it's a disaster. Every merchant nation in Europe now has a reason to loathe Denmark. England, the Dutch, the Germans, even Norway, which is technically his own kingdom. And again, he doesn't care, or rather, he cares more about coin than cohesion. And then, in one of the most jaw-dropping decisions of his reign, Christian mortgages all of Iceland. Yes, the entire island. In 1468, strapped for cash and trying to secure his daughter's marriage to a Scottish king, Christian pawns Orkney and Shetland to Scotland, lands Norway technically owns, and then quietly puts a financial leash on Iceland to keep the loan payments flowing. You wonder if he ever set foot there. Probably not, but the people of Iceland, they feel it. For decades they suffer under increased taxes, Danish trading monopolies, and a king who treats their island like it's a broken vending machine. His cruelty, like everything else about him, is bureaucratic, bland, but no less brutal. When Norway suffers economic collapse, Christian responds not with aid, but with stricter collection policies. Farmers starve, trade stalls, one winter a fishing community is wiped out by famine and the crown doesn't even send word. They're not worth the parchment. Christian's ledger has no column for compassion. He builds castles, of course, one must have a proper symbol of power. But instead of fountains or art, his fortresses are lined with tax records, tariffs, storage vaults and courtrooms. One Danish noble, after trying to protest Christian's war taxes, is dragged to the castle, beaten and imprisoned without trial. His lands are seized, his family disappears, no blood, no fire, just paperwork. Eventually even the nobles turn on him. In 1463, a group of Swedish rebels led by the legendary Sten Sture the Elder drives Christian out. Sweden declares independence. The Kalmar Union, already fraying at the edges, snaps entirely. Christian is humiliated, but he doesn't abdicate. He just slinks back to Denmark, licking his wounds, and raises taxes again to fund another campaign. This man treats rebellion the way toddlers treat no as a suggestion. By the end of his reign, Christian's deeply unpopular in all three kingdoms he technically still rules. Denmark tolerates him, Norway resents him, Sweden hates him, his treasury is a mess. His wars are lost, his alliances are shattered, but he still holds the crown, barely, until his death in 1481. So what do the historians say? Some call him a founder of modern state finance. Others label him a greedy failure who hollowed out three kingdoms chasing clumsy glory. There's an argument to be made that he was ahead of his time, thinking like a central banker centuries before central banks. But there's a line between innovation and exploitation, and Christian I tap-danced all over it. He wasn't a butcher, he didn't impale enemies or order mass executions, but he was a different kind of tyrant. The kind who ruins lives not with swords but with ledgers. The kind who looks at a kingdom and sees inventory were made, and in a strange way that kind of cruelty sticks with you longer. Because Vlad might kill you. Christian would let you live, then take your house, your bread, your tools, and finally your will to go on. As you leave Denmark, the wind cuts hard, biting through layers. Behind you a flag flaps half-heartedly atop a tax-funded castle. And all you can think is, sometimes the worst kings don't draw blood, they just drain it, one coin at a time. The mist is thick tonight as you cross into England, rolling in over the green hills like a warning. The Tower of London rises ahead, solemn and cold, a stone skeleton standing vigil over centuries of secrets. This is no fairy tale land. Not tonight, because you're about to meet Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, the final monarch of the House of York, and a man whose legacy is tangled in blood, bones, and a couple of very inconvenient missing children. Some call him a monster, others call him a scapegoat. You're going to have to decide for yourself. Just keep your hand on your dagger. It's the late 1400s, and England is exhausted. The Wars of the Roses have been tearing the kingdom apart for decades, a family feud stretched across battlefields and generations. Richard is the younger brother of King Edward IV, handsome, tall, golden-haired, and Richard is not. He's small, slight, and, if later reports are to be believed, physically deformed, possibly with a curved spine or a limp. He grows up in the shadow of his brothers, learning to be clever where they are bold, calculating where they are beloved. It's the perfect training for someone destined to seize the throne by whatever means necessary. When Edward IV dies in 1483, everything falls apart. The crown is supposed to pass to Edward's 12-year-old son, also named Edward. But Richard, appointed as Lord Protector, sees an opportunity, or maybe a threat. It all happens fast. Too fast. Edward V and his younger brother Richard, Duke of York, are moved into the Tower of London for their protection. You're there when the doors close. You feel the hush fall over the city. People wait for a coronation. It never comes. Instead, within weeks, Richard declares the marriage between Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville invalid. Illegitimate, he claims, which means their children, including Edward IV, have no claim to the throne. That's convenient. The nobles nod. Parliament agrees, and suddenly, Richard III is crowned King of England. But the boys, they're still in the tower, and they're never seen again. This is the moment where Richard's reputation splits in two like a cracked shield. On one side, you've got the traditional story, fed by Tudor historians and immortalised by Shakespeare, that Richard murdered the princes in the tower to secure his throne, smothered in their sleep, or stabbed, or buried under stone steps. The details vary, but the result? Two royal boys vanish, and Richard never explains why. On the other hand, modern revisionists argue there's no hard evidence, no confession, no body found, at least not until centuries later. Maybe it wasn't Richard. Maybe it was Henry VII after he won the crown. Maybe it was Buckingham, one of Richard's own allies. The truth is, we'll probably never know. But let's be real. Richard had motive, opportunity, and a reputation for solving problems. And this wasn't his only problem. He also had to crush rebellion after rebellion, all while looking over his shoulder for nobles with daggers up their sleeves. His reign lasts only 2 years, but it's packed with executions. Suspected traitors vanish overnight. Nobles fall from grace at the speed of a rumour. One former ally, William Hastings, is dragged from a council meeting and beheaded without trial. That's your quirky detail for tonight. Richard conducted what was essentially a boardroom meeting, then turned it into an impromptu execution. No warning, just business. Was it justice? Paranoia? Or just good old-fashioned power maintenance? Hard to say, but the air at Richard's court turns icy. His reign becomes a balancing act. One foot on the throne, the other on a trapdoor. By 1485, the opposition finally coalesces into a real threat. Henry Tudor, a distant claimant with barely enough noble blood to justify a title, let alone a crown. But he's got something Richard lacks: momentum. You stand on the field of Bosworth, one of those medieval battles that ends dynasties. Richard charges into the fray like a knight from legend, desperate to kill Henry himself. For a moment, he almost pulls it off, but the tide turns. He's unhorsed, surrounded, killed. His body is paraded through the streets, naked, thrown in a shallow grave. And then, the real legacy battle begins. Henry Tudor, now Henry VII, rewrites history like a man scribbling over a rival's diary. Richard becomes a villain, the hunchback tyrant of Shakespeare's Richard III, croaking, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," as he dies. A caricature, a cautionary tale. But centuries later, bones are found beneath a Leicester's parking lot. Richard's. His spine was curved, likely scoliosis. His skull bears wounds from multiple weapons. And suddenly, people start re-examining the myth. Was he really evil, or just unlucky? Some scholars defend him, point to his legal reforms, his charity toward the poor, his attempt to ease the burden of landowners crushed under decades of war. He may have tried to centralise royal justice. He may have actually believed in law and order, provided he was the one ordering it. But even if he didn't kill the princes, he benefited from their disappearance. Even if he wasn't the monstrous villain the Tudors claimed, he still ruled through fear, still executed rivals without due process, still grabbed the crown before it was cold on his nephew's head. You walk away from the tower, glancing back once at the thick stone walls, and you think about power, not just who has it, but how easily it makes truth melt away. Richard III's evil might be one of ambiguity. He's the king who vanished 2 children and maybe didn't. The king who reigned for 2 years and still haunts the English imagination. Maybe that's the most dangerous kind of ruler, the one you can't figure out. Because whether Richard was a monster or merely a man, 2 things are certain. The princes disappeared, and Richard didn't bring them back. Now the fog thickens. The silence settles differently here, like something's watching you from behind stone pillars and frostbitten pine. You're in Sweden now, deep into the 16th century, walking the corridors of Gripsholm Castle, where laughter has long since curdled into whispers. The candles are always lit but never warm. You're here to meet Erik the Wolf, King of Sweden, paranoid to the marrow, brilliant one day and unhinged the next. He's the kind of ruler who paints masterpieces in the morning and poisons nobles by dinner. Erik takes the throne in 1560, fresh-faced and charismatic. He's tall, blonde, a little theatrical, think Hamlet with access to a treasury. At first, the people are hopeful. He wants to elevate Sweden on the world stage, modernise the court, champion science and art. He writes poetry, he plays music, he studies astronomy. You'd almost like him if he weren't, well, increasingly unstable. The cracks start small, missed meetings, sudden mood swings, brooding silences, but they widen quickly, revealing a deep, dangerous paranoia. Erik becomes convinced that the nobility is plotting against him. Maybe some of them are, but he starts seeing betrayal in everything. The smallest gesture, a glance, a delay in kneeling, a comment made out of context, is enough to spark suspicion. And once Erik suspects you, you're already halfway into your grave. Enter the Stura family, powerful, respected nobles. and, unfortunately, caught in the blast radius of Eric's spiralling mind. Eric has one of them, Niels Stewart, arrested. No real evidence, just a general feeling that Niels might someday challenge his power. The poor guy is imprisoned, released, humiliated with public punishments, and then imprisoned again. It's all a warm-up for the real disaster to come. On May 24, 1567, in the middle of one of Eric's episodes, he snaps. You're there, just outside the chamber, hearing the muffled screams as Eric personally murders Niels Stewart with a dagger, at orders, does it himself, blood everywhere. He stabs the young noble over and over in a frenzy, as his guards look on, stunned into silence. Then, with no hesitation, he orders the immediate execution of several other noble prisoners from the same family. No trial, no defence, just sudden, violent death. This event becomes known as the Stewart murders, and it marks the official point of no return for Eric's reign. Sweden watches in horror as the king who once composed sonnets now starts collecting corpses like trophies, but the thing about Eric is that he's not always like this. That's what makes him terrifying. He'll plunge into guilt afterward, write apologies, send gifts to families he's devastated. He'll try to explain himself in long, rambling letters full of symbols and celestial metaphors. I was deceived, he'll say, or I saw it in the stars. He genuinely seems to believe he's under attack, not just by men, but by fate, by forces beyond control. Your quirky fact tonight? Eric had a secret cipher, a codebook full of astrological symbols he used to interpret politics. He genuinely thought the alignment of planets could help him uncover plots against him. Mercury in retrograde didn't just mean a bad mood, it meant someone had to die. His obsession with astrology becomes all-consuming. He won't sign royal documents if the stars are wrong. He won't go outside on certain days. Advisors who question this? Fired. Or worse, he starts dressing more erratically, sometimes in royal robes, sometimes in ragged black, wandering the castle like a ghost hunting conspiracies. His court tries to cover for him, whispering excuses, deflecting his fury, but even they can't keep up. Eric begins randomly arresting courtiers. Some disappear, some return visibly broken. His younger brothers, especially John, who later becomes John III, start quietly building a case for his removal. Not because they want power, though they might, but because they fear for their lives. By 1568 it is impossible to pretend things are okay. Eric's episodes grow more frequent. He isolates himself, talks to shadows, eats erratically, sleeps in bursts. Some servants report him screaming in empty rooms, begging ghosts to leave him alone. His enemies gather. His brothers lead a coup, is almost shockingly bloodless. Everyone's just done. They find him pacing, mumbling about betrayal, and quietly take him into custody. And now, Eric becomes something new, a royal prisoner. He's locked away, shuffled between castles, guarded by men who aren't sure if he's a tragic figure or a rabid animal. For the next 8 years, he lives in increasing isolation. He keeps writing, sketching, still convinced he's the rightful king. But he's also getting sicker. His mental health deteriorates rapidly, and his body follows. Then, in 1571, he dies. The official story is food poisoning, but many believe he was murdered, poisoned by his jailers on orders from John III. One report claims they laced his pea soup with arsenic. That's the final indignity. A king who ruled in velvet and terror taken out by a bowl of soup. Historians today tread carefully with Eric. Was he evil, or was he a genius shattered by the pressures of power? His early reforms were forward-thinking, his interest in the arts was genuine. But none of it can erase the fact that he murdered innocents, ruled by fear, and became a one-man wrecking ball to his own legacy. Mental illness doesn't make someone evil, but when mental illness is fused with absolute power, unchecked by any law, any doctor, any institution, that's when things go dark. Eric's reign is a cautionary tale of what happens when a brilliant, broken mind is given the authority to rewrite reality. You leave Gripsholm Castle as the wind shifts. Somewhere behind you, you swear you hear a soft voice reciting poetry. Or maybe it's just the walls remembering. Either way, one thing's clear. A king doesn't have to be sane to be dangerous. Sometimes the madness is the weapon. The scenery shifts again, and suddenly you're plunged into the sticky chaos of the Byzantine Empire. Not the golden age of mosaics and saints, but the Sahik's blood-slicked era where power changes hands like a game of hot coals and nobody survives too long to enjoy the crown. You've arrived in Constantinople, late 12th century, and the stench of betrayal hangs heavy in the air. This is the world of Andronikos I Komnenos, a man so reviled, so feared, and so brutal that even in an empire with no shortage of tyrants, he stands out like a spike through the forehead. And that's not a metaphor. That's just how he finishes people off. You find him, at first, charming, surprisingly so. Tall, silver-haired, sharp-witted, he has the look of a disgraced philosopher, and the charisma of a man who knows just how close he is to getting everything he wants. Andronikos doesn't come from nowhere. He's a member of the elite Komnenos dynasty, cousin to Emperor Manuel I, and for much of his early life a slippery political operator, exiled, imprisoned, then exiled again. He escapes from dungeons, flees from one city to the next, seduces noble women, allegedly sleeps with the Queen of Jerusalem, and basically collects scandals like other people collect stamps. Then in 1183 everything changes. Emperor Manuel dies. His son Alexios II is just a child, with his mother, Maria of Antioch, acting as regent. Andronikos sees his chance. He rides into Constantinople with an army and immediately starts chipping away at the regency. His message: the empire is weak, corrupt, drowning in foreign influence, especially from Latin Catholics like Maria, who's deceased for her Western connections. You're there when the city starts to turn. Riots break out. Andronikos fans the flames, whispering that Maria is poisoning her son, that she's conspiring with the Pope, that she's selling the empire piece by piece. The people eat it up. And then, once he's secured enough support, Andronikos has Maria arrested, thrown into a cell, and quietly strangled. Alexios II, still technically emperor, for about a month. Andronikos forces him to sign off on reforms and purges, using the boy like a ventriloquist's dummy. And when he's done with the charade, he has Alexios strangled too, a 13-year-old emperor executed by his guardian. That's your first real look at how Andronikos plays this game. There are no safe pieces on his board, not even children. Once he seizes the throne, Andronikos launches a full-blown reign of terror. His enemies? Executed. Their families? Confiscated, banished or mutilated. High-ranking nobles are hauled into the streets and publicly blinded, castrated or tied to wagons and dragged until bones break. One general accused of plotting against him is hung upside down over a fire and slowly roasted until he confesses. Confesses to what exactly is never made clear. Doesn't really matter. But here's the twist. Andronikos isn't just bloodthirsty. He thinks he's reforming the empire. He genuinely believes that fear is the only thing that will save Byzantium from collapse. And on some twisted level, he's not wrong. Corruption was rampant. Nobles were hoarding wealth and abusing power. He reduces taxes on the poor, cracks down on bribery, and makes sure that even the wealthiest families aren't above the law. Problem is, the law now starts with, do whatever Andronikos wants. And yet, he isn't content to rule by fear alone. He marries Agnes of France, the 12-year-old widow of Alexios II. That's your fringe fact tonight. Andronikos, well into his 50s, marries the child bride of the boy emperor he murdered. And somehow the Byzantine court nods politely like this is fine. Normal. Nothing to see here. His foreign policy is equally disastrous. He antagonises the Normans, slights the Venetians, and picks a fight with just about every Western trading power passing through Constantinople. You see him kick Latin merchants out of the city, seize their assets, and refuse compensation. Retaliation comes quickly. Norman invaders from Sicily sack Greek cities. Tensions with the West explode. And in the middle of it all, Andronikos becomes more paranoid than ever. He sees assassins everywhere. He orders executions for whispers. He stops trusting his own guards. There's a moment, burned into the memories of everyone who survives his court, when he personally tortures a noble suspected of treason, then forces the man's son to watch. Then he executes the son too. By 1185 the empire is ready to boil over. The people, once eager to purge corruption, are now terrified, broke, and hungry. Riots erupt again, but this time they're against Andronikos. A noble named Isaac Angelus leads a successful uprising. You're there in the palace when Andronikos realises it's over. He tries to flee disguised as a commoner, but he's captured at the port. And then, the people of Constantinople throw a going-away party like no other. Andronikos is paraded through the streets in chains, beaten by the crowd, his hair ripped out in handfuls. They drag him to the hippodrome, the same place where he once watched others die, and they tear him to pieces. His eyes are gouged out, his teeth knocked loose. He is hacked, stabbed, and finally strung up by his ankles between two pillars until he expires in agony. No clean execution, no royal dignity, just rage, centuries of it, taken out on one man. Historians remain divided. Some argue Andronikos had a sincere desire to cleanse the empire, to push back against aristocratic rot. Others say he was just a narcissist with delusions of grandeur and no off-switch. Even his reforms, they say, were just convenient tools to justify murder. And yet his death doesn't save Byzantium. The empire limps on, wounded, fractured, vulnerable. You walk away from Constantinople in silence, because Andronikos didn't destroy the empire with fire and sword alone. He used reform like a knife, slicing away rot until he reached the bone, and then kept cutting. He may have thought himself a saviour, but by the end, even the stones of the city wanted him gone. The desert wind hits you next, dry, hot, and full of whispers. You've travelled far from the icy castles and gloomy corridors of Europe, straight into the blistering heart of the Levant during the time of the Crusades. Dust hangs in the air like suspended time. Jerusalem, that eternal battlefield of faith and fire, looms on the horizon. This isn't the gleaming holy city of paintings and pilgrim songs. It's tense, paranoid, smouldering with old blood, and at the centre of it all stands Fulk of Anjou, better known as Fulk, King of Jerusalem, a man who wears piety like armour, but rules with a sword pointed at everyone, including his own allies. You might be thinking, wait, wasn't Fulk a devout crusader king? Yes, and also a dangerously calculating one with a serious issue trusting anyone, especially when that anyone had opinions, or land, or a reputation that threatened his own. Fulk starts off as Count of Anjou, a French nobleman with ambition soaked into his bones. He marries well, very well. His first wife, Ermengarde, gives him heirs and some political leverage. His second wife, Melisenda, heir to the kingdom of Jerusalem. That's the jackpot. Fulk doesn't just marry into power, he inherits it. When King Baldwin VI dies in 1131, Fulk and Melisenda are crowned co-rulers of Jerusalem. Equal in theory, but Fulk has no intention of sharing. That's when things get messy, really messy. You're at court when the shift begins. Fulk surrounds himself with knights and advisors from Anjou, foreigners in the eyes of the native nobles and the Jerusalem-born elite. He pushes Melisenda to the sidelines, quietly cuts her out of decisions, appoints his cronies to key posts. You can feel the tension in the air, like a cracked icon waiting to fall. The local barons hate it, the church hates it, even the common people start grumbling. Melisenda isn't just popular, she's beloved, and watching her get pushed around by this grim-faced Frenchman doesn't sit well. But Fulk doesn't back down. If anything, he doubles down. He starts tightening his grip on the military, reassigning lands, undermining rival families. When his critics speak out, he doesn't argue, he eliminates. One of the most infamous examples is Hugh the Bed of Jaffa, Melisenda's cousin and a powerful noble in the kingdom. Fulk accuses him of treason. No evidence, no witnesses, just whispers. Hugh flees but is attacked, some say ambushed under royal orders, and gravely wounded. You hear the rumours. The whole trial was a setup, that Fulk wanted Hugh out of the way to send a message. And when the people of Jerusalem don't buy it, things reach a breaking point. An open rebellion flares. The court fractures. Melisenda, backed by the church and the native nobility, stands up and reclaims power. For a moment you think Fulk's about to end up dangling from a parapet, but no. Somehow the two patch things up, or at least pretend to. From 1136 onward, Melisenda regains authority, and the two rule as uneasy co-sovereigns. It's less of a reconciliation and more of a ceasefire. You can still see the tension in their eyes during court meetings, like two generals pretending they're not planning each other's next downfall. But Fulk doesn't stop scheming. That's the thing with him. He believes the throne and the kingdom must be controlled. And when he can't control it with diplomacy, he uses fear. He starts reinforcing the castles of the kingdom, not just against external threats, but to keep local nobles in check. He places spies in the court, tightens trade. In one particularly cold move, he strips a bishop of his land and influence simply for backing Melisenda too enthusiastically. You can almost hear the crack of a whip behind every decree. And yet, here's your fringe fact. Fulk was also one of the first Crusader kings to extensively use military architecture as a form of domination. He didn't just build castles, he built psychological warfare. Each fortress was placed with surgical precision to dominate roads, towns, and enemy territories. It wasn't just about defence, it was about reminding everyone, I see you, I own you. His last years are a mix of unrest and resignation. He spends more time outside Jerusalem, possibly to escape the chill of his own court. Then in 1143, during a hunting trip near Acre, Fulk falls from his horse. Sounds harmless, but he hits his head, hard. There are no surgeons, no real medicine, just prayers and bad wine. Within a few days he's dead. And suddenly Melisenda rules alone. Some say she wept, others say she smiled. The truth, like everything in Fulk's legacy, is cloudy. Historians are split on him. Was he a visionary consolidator trying to stabilise a vulnerable crusader state? Or was he just another foreign lord who mistook ruthless control for leadership? He did strengthen the military. He did modernise castle defence, but he also created a culture of distrust, centralised power so aggressively it nearly broke the kingdom, and alienated the very people who could have helped him keep it. And don't forget, he tried to erase his own wife from power in a kingdom where queens weren't just consorts, they were commanders. Melisenda outlived him, outruled him, and is remembered far more fondly than the man who tried to sideline her. You leave the Levant under a sky painted with smoke and salt. Fulk's name doesn't echo through Jerusalem's streets anymore, but the castles he built still stand, cold, proud, and watching. That's the legacy of a king like him, not remembered, just feared for a while, then replaced. The wind shifts again, this time to the damp chill of the English countryside. The soil is soft underfoot, but it's not from rain, it's the weight of history pressing down like a millstone. You've crossed back into England in the year 1066, just as the island is about to be flipped like a tavern table in a bar fight. This is the moment of invasion, of swords and fire, and at the centre of it all is a man whose name you definitely know, William the Conqueror. But the sanitised version they fed you in school, the one with the tapestry and the horses and the proud Norman knights, left out just how cruel, how cold and how calculating this first Norman king of England really was. You arrive just in time for the aftermath of the Battle of Hastings. William's Norman forces have crushed King Harold's army. Bodies litter the fields, English nobles are dead or fleeing, and William, Duke no longer, claims the crown, not through lineage, not through invitation, but by the sword. He isn't here to negotiate. He's here to own everything, and he makes that fact painfully, irrevocably clear. You watch as he begins the Normanisation of England. Every English earl who supported Harold, replaced. Their lands, leased and handed to Norman barons. Their peasants, now under foreign masters. Even the church isn't spared. English bishops are yanked out and replaced with Norman clergy. Latin floods the administration, erasing Old English from law and court life like chalk in the rain. William doesn't just want to rule, he wants to overwrite the entire system. But nothing screams new management like the harrying of the North, William's most infamous act of cruelty. It's 1069, and northern England is rebelling. Locals are furious at Norman rule. They want a return to Anglo-Saxon leadership. William responds not with diplomacy, not with appeasement, but with scorched earth. Literally. You're there as the campaign unfolds, and it's not a battle, it's a massacre. William's troops march through Yorkshire and beyond, burning every village, salting fields, poisoning wells, killing livestock, destroying granaries. Crops are torched, people, men, women, children are hunted down and slaughtered or left to starve. Entire swathes of countryside are turned into uninhabitable wasteland. Chroniclers estimate over 100,000 people die, many freeze or starve to death in the aftermath, and the best part, William doesn't deny any of it. He even brags that he left the north so barren, not a cow remained to low, nor a plough to turn the earth. That's your fringe fact tonight. The Domesday Book, completed years later to catalogue England's wealth and land ownership, records large swaths of the north as simply waste. Not because the land was bad, because William burned it flat. You wonder if it was strategic. And sure, some argue the harrying was a tactical necessity, put down the rebellion, show strength, prevent further uprisings. But even Norman writers of the time admit it went way too far. It wasn't just brutal, it was excessive, deliberately inhumane. Like he wanted the survivors to remember it in their bones for generations. Spoiler, they did. William wasn't a rage-fueled tyrant, though shouldn't us. That's what makes his cruelty more unnerving. He was precise. He believed deeply in order, hierarchy, and control. And if that required mass murder, so be it. This is a man who builds castles like they're chess pieces, dotting England with fortresses designed to both defend and dominate. He understands that fear is a language everyone speaks, and he becomes fluent. You walk through the construction of the Tower of London, one of his first royal fortresses, and it's not just a military project. It's a message. Every stone says, "You lost, I'm not going anywhere." The same logic applies to his land survey, the infamous Domesday Book, a nationwide audit so detailed it includes how many pigs you owned, whether you had a mill, and even the number of slaves you kept. It's cold, bureaucratic, invasive, and unprecedented. William doesn't just take England, he measures it, inventories it, claims it down to the last goat. But for all his ruthlessness, William isn't invincible. Toward the end of his life, he loses control of Normandy, watches his sons turn on each other, and becomes increasingly paranoid. He grows heavy, sickly. When he dies in 1087, after a fall from his horse during yet another military campaign, his bloated body bursts during the funeral. Literally bursts. The story goes that the monks couldn't fit him into the stone coffin, and when they forced it shut, his abdomen ruptured. The cathedral filled with the stench of decay, and the mourners fled. That's how England's first Norman king left the world, exploding in a church while his empire groaned under the weight of his conquests. Modern historians still wrestle with William's legacy. Was he a brilliant administrator? A necessary reformer? A foundational figure in English history? Sure. But also, he was terrifying. A man who wielded structure like a cudgel, who imposed a new identity on an entire people whether they liked it or not. He was the first English monarch whose rule was built entirely on fear, not tradition, not divine right, not bloodline, fear. You leave the tower's shadow with the image of William still burned into your mind, not on horseback, not in his coronation robes, but as a towering presence who held a knife to a country's throat and called it progress. Because sometimes the most dangerous kings aren't the ones who lose control, it's the ones who never do. You're still in Central Europe, but now the land has shifted under your feet. The green fields are wider, the hills more ragged, and the scars of war run deep and quiet through the countryside. You're in Hungary now, riding through the valleys of the Carpathians, where medieval resilience meets medieval ruthlessness. This is the kingdom of Belafbor, King of Hungary and Croatia, and a man whose legacy is a strange cocktail of destruction, rebirth, and blood-soaked policy decisions. Some call him a saviour, others say he was just another monarch who believed mercy was for the weak and rebuilding was only worth it if you burned it all down first.
You meet him in the early 13th century, during a lull between disasters. Bela is born into a royal house that has known its fair share of trauma. His father, Andrew II, was a terrible king, a man so irresponsible he practically gave away the kingdom to his cronies like it was a medieval yard sale. By the time Bela comes of age, Hungary is a fractured, overpromised mess. Nobles are too powerful, the royal treasury is empty, and the only thing keeping everything from collapsing is pure inertia. Bela, of course, wants to fix it. Great idea in theory. In practice, it means centralizing power, hard. He starts by trying to undo his father's land giveaways, reclaiming lands and titles that were granted to nobles, bishops, and knights. Unsurprisingly, they're not thrilled. You can feel the pressure building, like a pot boiling with the lid clamped too tight. And while this tension might have erupted into civil war eventually, it doesn't get the chance. Because something worse arrives first: the Mongols. In 1241, Genghis Khan's grandsons arrive on the doorstep of Europe, and Hungary is directly in their path. Bela tries to rally the nobles, but many are still bitter about those land seizures and slow to mobilize. The Mongols don't wait. You're there at the Battle of Mohi, one of the most crushing defeats in medieval Hungarian history. The Mongols use feints, traps, and firepower like nothing the Hungarians have ever seen. Bela barely escapes with his life. The rest of the kingdom? Not so lucky. What follows is nothing short of apocalyptic. Cities are burned, villages razed, entire populations vanish. It's estimated that up to half of Hungary's population dies in the Mongol invasion. By sword, by starvation, by sheer chaos. Towns are wiped from the map. The survivors flee to mountains and forests, abandoning everything they can't carry. You hear the stories whispered around campfires. how entire churches were filled with refugees and then set ablaze, how rivers ran thick with ash and blood. And Bela? He hides, flees to the Adriatic coast, sends desperate letters to the Pope and other monarchs begging for aid. No one comes. They're all too busy praying the Mongols don't head their way. Then something miraculous happens. The Mongols just leave. Historians still debate why. Some say the death of the Great Khan pulled them back. Others argue logistics, climate, or shifting priorities. But whatever the reason, in 1242 the Mongol army withdraws from Hungary, leaving behind smoldering ruins and silence. And Bela returns to a kingdom that no longer exists. Now comes the part where Bela earns his complicated legacy. Instead of collapsing under the weight of loss, he starts rebuilding, aggressively. He grants tax exemptions to towns that agree to build stone fortifications. He invites foreigners, Germans, Vlachs, even Cumans, to repopulate the empty lands. He commissions new castles, encourages trade, reforms the military. It's almost messianic, a kingdom reborn from the ashes. He earns the nickname the second founder of the state. Sounds noble, right? Yeah, until you look a little closer. Because Bela rebuilds through pressure. If your village refuses to construct fortifications, he withholds aid. If you resist new taxes, your town is starved of trade. He plays nobles off one another, regrants land to those loyal to him while punishing others through exile or execution. It's not a government, it's a royal boot on the neck with a crown on top. You see him reshaping the social structure with as much mercy as a blacksmith reshaping iron. Beat it, heat it, and bend it until it fits. He also forces the Cumans, a semi-nomadic Turkic people, to settle and Christianize. This causes chaos. The Cumans hate it. The Hungarians hate the Cumans. Riots break out. A Cuman chief is killed. The Cumans retaliate by ransacking towns on their way out of the country. Instead of admitting this policy backfired, Bela invites them back later, on stricter terms. Trust, once shattered, is rebuilt with fear. Here's your fringe fact tonight. Bela IV once funded the reconstruction of a monastery by seizing church lands he had previously granted immunity. That's right, he took land from the church to build a church. That's medieval monarch energy at its finest. He also wages war against his neighbors when convenient. He fights Austria, meddles in Bohemian affairs, and even starts a nasty little conflict with his own son, Stephen V. It escalates into full-on civil war when Bela tries to deny Stephen's claims to certain lands, father against son, again. Because why not add family betrayal to a CV already stained with conquest and coercion? Bela dies in 1270, exhausted and likely frustrated. He rebuilt Hungary from rubble into a functioning state. But it never quite thanked him. The nobles still resisted, his family still betrayed him. The scars of Mongol terror never fully faded. And even the people he saved remembered the taxes, the demands, the pressurized rule wrapped in a ribbon of rebirth. So what do historians say? Bela IV is hailed as a rebuilder, a reformer. But the dark truth is that he rebuilt with the same intensity that others on this list destroyed. He believed in strength, not mercy. In walls, not trust. He didn't mourn the loss of the old Hungary. He saw it as a blank slate to impose his vision. You ride out of Hungary under a sky that's trying to forget. The roads are paved now, the city's walled. But the silence between villages lingers, full of names never spoken again. Bela wasn't the king who saved Hungary. He was the king who broke it, then hammered the pieces into something new, and never apologized for the shape it took. The mist rolls thick again as you ride west into a country that barely seems to know where it ends and begins. You're in England now, or what's left of England, during the 12th century civil war known as the Anarchy. The name is not poetic exaggeration, it's literal. For nearly 20 years, England is trapped in chaos, and at the eye of the storm is King Stephen of Blois, a man whose reign is a lesson in how even a weak king can unleash absolute devastation simply by refusing to let go. Stephen isn't supposed to be king. Not really. The throne was meant to pass to Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I, and the only surviving legitimate heir after her brother drowns in the White Ship disaster. But when Henry dies, the English nobles panic. A woman on the throne? In medieval England? That's practically sacrilege. Enter Stephen, Henry's nephew, charming, affable, and just ambitious enough to commit treason with a smile. You're there the day Stephen rushes to London in 1135, makes a few promises, spreads some gold, and snatches the crown while Matilda's still gathering her allies. It's quick, it's dirty, and it works, sort of. For a few years, Stephen plays at being king, issuing royal writs, smiling for the barons, balancing on a tightrope of uneasy support. But Matilda isn't the type to sit quietly and wait for fate to do her favors. In 1139, she invades. And then the real nightmare begins. The anarchy is less a war than a nationwide collapse of order. Nobles switch sides weekly. Castles are built and torn down and built again. Whole regions operate like independent kingdoms. Laws mean nothing. Royal decrees are printed, ignored, contradicted, and reissued. You walk through villages that have changed hands 6 times in a year. The people don't even bother learning their lords' names anymore. Stephen, to his credit, or maybe to his downfall, is relentless. He keeps fighting, keeps pushing, keeps claiming to be king, even as his influence shrinks, his supporters desert him, and his treasury bleeds out. He's captured in 1141 during the Battle of Lincoln, thrown into chains like a common criminal. Matilda is declared Lady of the English and prepares to be crowned. But then she screws up. She marches into London like it's already hers, starts acting like a queen, demands money, insults the nobles, and they turn on her. Stephen's allies regroup. Matilda is chased from the city, Stephen is released in a prisoner exchange, and just like that, the war drags on for another decade. This isn't just incompetence, it's stubbornness with a body count, because Stephen refuses to concede. He refuses to compromise. He doesn't govern, he just clings. You hear it again and again as you travel, peasants muttering, "God and his angels sleep," quoting a chronicler who summed it up best, "Christ and his saints were asleep." Because under Stephen, the suffering isn't just military, it's social collapse. Nobles build unauthorized castles, adultering castles they're called, and use them to wage private wars, extort peasants, kidnap and ransom travelers. One baron digs a pit full of vipers and threatens to throw hostages into it. Another taxes people for walking through their own farmland. Stephen's government can't stop it. Because Stephen's government barely exists, he's too busy fighting for legitimacy to actually rule. And when he does act, it's usually too late or too harsh. In one case, a group of barons suspected of supporting Matilda are invited to court under a flag of truce, then arrested and tortured. That's your fringe fact tonight. Stephen didn't just fight a civil war. He waged psychological warfare, manipulating trust until no one felt safe even inside a chapel or royal hall. He also burns bridges with the church, alienating bishops who once supported him. He seizes church lands, breaks oaths, imprisons clerics. The Pope issues warnings, Stephen ignores them. When your spiritual advisors start plotting against you, you know the crown's slipping. And yet, despite all this, the war remains locked in a grim stalemate. Neither Stephen nor Matilda can finish the other off. Castles are stormed, alliances crumble, years pass. Entire generations grow up never knowing peace. Children become soldiers, roads vanish under weeds. By 1147, both sides are exhausted. The turning point finally comes in 1153, not from Stephen or Matilda, but from her son, Henry of Anjou, the future Henry II. Young, bold, competent in ways neither his mother nor Stephen ever were. He invades with just enough strength and just enough diplomacy to force Stephen's hand. But even then, Stephen doesn't surrender. Not until his own son, Eustace, dies suddenly. Some say from illness, others whisper divine punishment. With no heir left worth fighting for, Stephen finally cuts a deal. The Treaty of Winchester declares Henry his successor. Stephen remains king in name, but the writing's on the wall. When he dies in 1154, the crown passes peacefully, for the first time in decades. So, was Stephen evil? Not in the theatrical, mustache-twirling sense, but he earns his place here by being one of the most disastrously stubborn kings in medieval history. He could have stopped the war, he could have abdicated, he could have negotiated. Instead, he chose pride over peace, and hundreds of thousands suffered for it. Historians waffle on him. Some say he was a good man in a bad situation. Others say he was a weak ruler who never should have worn the crown. But either way, one thing is clear. Stephen's reign is proof that evil doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just refuses to listen, refuses to step aside, refuses to let go, even when everything around it is burning. You walk away from England with the echoes of screams and the clatter of collapsing walls behind you. Stephen's legacy isn't tyranny, it's tragedy. And in the end, the difference is just how many people had to suffer before the final curtain fell. The temperature drops again as you sail northward, following the coastline into rugged fjords and snow-draped peaks. You've arrived in Norway, but forget the romanticized sagas of noble Vikings and serene kings. You're here to meet Olaf II Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, but don't let the saint fool you. Before he was canonized, before churches bore his name and relics were paraded through towns, Olaf ruled with an iron fist and a conversion strategy that involved more sword than sermon. You're not here for miracles. You're here for the man who tried to baptize an entire kingdom by drowning it in blood. It's the early 11th century, and Norway is fractured. Tribal chieftains rule their territories like mini-kingdoms, each fiercely protective of their autonomy and traditions. Christianity has begun to trickle in from the south, but most Norwegians still cling to the old gods: Thor, Odin, Freya. Olaf sees that as a problem, a spiritual threat, and more importantly, a political obstacle. Because Olaf doesn't just want to be a king, he wants to be the king. And that means not just ruling the land, but shaping its soul. You meet him as a young warrior, traveling through Europe, fighting as a mercenary. He's already vicious, bold in battle, ruthless in tactics. By the time he returns to Norway in 1015, he's ready to claim the crown, and he does it the old-fashioned way, with steel. He forces rival chieftains into submission, slaughters those who resist, and installs loyal allies in their place. Within a few years, he declares himself king of all Norway. That's when the forced conversions begin. Olaf doesn't send missionaries, he sends armies. Refuse baptism? Expect fire. Expect the tip of a spear. You stand in one village as Olaf's soldiers arrive. The priest chants Latin over a barrel of cold water while the warriors surround a group of frightened farmers. One man refuses, says Thor protects his people. Olaf has him executed on the spot. His house is burned, his family dragged off. Then the rest are baptized, just like that. That's your fringe fact tonight. Olaf reportedly ordered the teeth of pagans knocked out to prevent them from chanting old prayers during forced baptisms. Doesn't sound very saintly, does it? And yet, Olaf believes he's doing God's work. He justifies every act of cruelty as necessary purification. He believes the sword and the cross are not opposing symbols, but partners in divine justice. His laws reflect this mindset. Pagan practices, banned; blasphemy, death. Loyalty to the king and loyalty to Christ become the same thing. Disagree with one and you're doomed by both. But ruling by force only lasts so long. Olaf's brutal tactics start to backfire. The nobles he replaced begin to rise against him. Regions revolt. His own people, weary of endless bloodshed and religious extremism, begin to turn. Olaf's enemies ally with the Danish king, Canute the Great, who sees an opportunity to extend his control. In 1028, Olaf is forced into exile. He flees to Russia, bitter and brooding, still convinced he's been chosen by God. He spends 2 years there, plotting his return. While in Kiev, he begins to reshape his image. No longer just a warlord, he now presents himself as a martyr in waiting. When he finally returns to Norway in 1030, it's with a sense of divine mission. But things don't go as planned. You stand on the battlefield at Stiklestad, surrounded by farmers, nobles, and warriors who once feared Olaf and now want him dead. He fights valiantly, but this isn't a noble last stand. It's a desperate man clinging to a crown nobody wants him to wear. He's cut down, reportedly by multiple attackers. Some say a lance pierced his side, others say he was hacked with axes. Either way, he dies. Alone, hated, defeated. And yet, that's not where the story ends. Almost immediately, stories of miracles begin to swirl. His body, exhumed a year later, is said to be incorrupt. People claim healing at his grave. A cult of sainthood forms, driven partly by genuine devotion and partly by the political need to unify a fractured kingdom. By 1031, Olaf is canonized by the church. Statues are erected. Pilgrimages begin. The same man who once ordered pagan altars torched is now Saint Olaf, patron of Norway. Historians today split sharply over his legacy. Some paint him as a unifier, a necessary tyrant who brought Norway under one crown and into the Christian fold. Others argue he was a fanatic, a man who dressed authoritarianism in religious garb and ruled through intimidation. His sainthood doesn't erase the atrocities. It just buries them under a pile of incense and iconography. You walk away from the site of his final battle, the ground still whispering his name. It's not the chants of monks you hear, it's the cries of those he forced to kneel, the screams of those who died resisting. Olaf didn't conquer Norway for God, he conquered it for himself, and then handed it to God afterward for validation. It's easy to canonize the dead, harder to remember what they did when they were alive. The heat returns as you ride south, down through the dusty plains of the Iberian Peninsula and straight into the sun-scorched heart of Castile. It's the early 14th century, and the royal court glimmers with gold and polished stone. But don't let the shimmer distract you. Behind every silken curtain and gilded crucifix is a blade. You've arrived during the reign of Alfonso XI of Castile, a king known for military prowess, royal pageantry, and a deeply casual relationship with murder. He was clever, commanding, and wildly effective on the battlefield. But off it? He ruled with the kind of favoritism and bloodthirsty paranoia that makes you wonder if power had already rotted something inside him. You meet Alfonso in his early years, crowned king at the age of 1 after his father dies unexpectedly. The regency period is chaos. His mother, his grandmother, the nobles, everyone wants a piece of the throne. Civil war brews before he can even walk. The court is less a government and more a knife fight in a linen closet. And when Alfonso finally takes control as a teenager, he doesn't waste time with reconciliation. He doesn't forget who slighted him, and he doesn't forgive. His early acts of rule include dragging former regents to court, stripping them of their titles, and, when the evidence is even kind of questionable, executing them. Publicly, spectacularly, sometimes with fire, sometimes with ropes, always with a little extra flair. You're there in Seville.
When one of the noble families falls out of favour, within a week 3 brothers are accused of treason. Their heads are displayed on spikes outside the city gate like a message no one really needs help deciphering. Then comes the Alcazar massacre. That's your fringe fact tonight. And it's not exactly printed in the school books. One of Alfonso's top military commanders, Alvar Núñez Osorio, grows too powerful, too beloved. He becomes a rival in everything but name. Alfonso invites him to court under a flag of truce. They embrace in the courtyard. The next morning, Alvar's entire family is rounded up, tortured and killed. His body, stripped or dragged through the streets and thrown into a pit. The excuse? A vague claim of conspiracy. The truth? Alfonso didn't want anyone else getting applause. But Alfonso doesn't just thrive on domestic bloodshed. He lives for the battlefield. Castile is still knee-deep in the Reconquista, that centuries-long campaign to retake the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. And Alfonso, he's good at it, ruthlessly, uncomfortably good. His campaigns against the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada are relentless. He besieges cities with such ferocity that even hardened soldiers blink at the brutality. Towns are starved into surrender. Refugees are denied mercy. Entire garrisons are slaughtered once the gates fall. In 1340, he scores his greatest victory at the Battle of Rio Salado, a massive clash where Alfonso's forces crush a combined Muslim army from Morocco and Granada. It's a defining moment, a high watermark, and Alfonso milks it for all it's worth. Coins are minted, churches are commissioned, chronicles are written with just enough exaggeration to paint him as divinely guided. But even when he's winning, he's bleeding the kingdom dry. War costs money, and Alfonso funds it by squeezing the peasantry and playing favourites with tax exemptions. If you're part of the elite and loyal to him, you pay less. If you're not, you starve. The royal treasury flows through narrow channels, mostly toward his court, his mistresses and his favourites, a system of royal patronage that fuels resentment at every level. And speaking of favourites, let's talk about Leonor de Guzman, his mistress. She's not just a passing affair, she becomes his unofficial queen, bearing him 10 children while the actual queen, Maria of Portugal is sidelined in humiliating fashion. Court politics revolve around Leonor. Her family gains titles, lands, power. Alfonso protects her like she's the kingdom itself. When anyone dares criticise the relationship, they're exiled, or worse. Even the church struggles to get him to rein it in. He responds with more money, more cathedrals, the usual medieval repentance through bribery. His enemies don't just fester in obscenities, they plot. But Alfonso stays ahead, always a step quicker, always ready with a bribe or a sword. You start to get the picture. This is a man who believes loyalty is currency and fear is faster than diplomacy. He can be charming, even generous, but only when it serves a purpose. Mercy is not in his toolkit. Order is. Then comes the twist. In 1350, Alfonso lays siege to Gibraltar, another strategic prize in his lifelong campaign to carve Christian dominance into the bones of Spain. But this time the enemy isn't a sword or a rebellion, it's disease. The Black Death has reached Iberia. It's already devouring towns and thinning armies, but Alfonso refuses to stop the siege. He knows the risks, he doesn't care, and sure enough, in March he falls ill. Fevers, black swellings, painful death. The plague doesn't care how many battles you've won. Alfonso dies in his campaign tent surrounded by generals who are already wondering which direction to run. His body is hastily interred, and within hours the army collapses. The siege ends. His death marks not just the end of a reign, but the unravelling of an order built on his terrifying grip. So, what do historians say? Depends who you ask. Some call him a military genius, a master of realpolitik who restored strength to the crown. Others see a tyrant who prioritised legacy over justice and personal pleasure over responsibility. He left a kingdom that feared him, but not one that necessarily respected him. Even his own children ended up fighting each other in a dynastic bloodbath. That's a legacy too, just not the kind he wanted. You leave Castile feeling like you've just stepped out of a pressure cooker. Alfonso's reign was full of victories, yes, but always at a price. His justice was sharp, his love conditional, his loyalty purchasable. In the end, he wasn't a mad king or a fool, he was a professional tyrant, efficient, ruthless, and always one step from turning on anyone. That's the kind of evil that's hardest to see coming, the one dressed in armour, backed by scripture, flanked by banners. Because when a king writes his own rules, the law doesn't matter, only the crown does. The landscape turns jagged and harsh as you move southeast into the Balkans, a region carved and recarved by centuries of war, empire and cold steel ambition. The wind here whistles through the mountains like a death chant, and the earth feels as if it's still absorbing the horror of what was done to it. You've arrived in the Byzantine-controlled lands of the late 10th and early 11th century, just in time to meet a man whose nickname alone should freeze your blood. This is Basil Gan, Emperor of Byzantium, also known as Basil the Bulgar Slayer. And no, that's not a metaphor. It's a title he earned the old-fashioned way, by slaughtering and maiming his enemies so completely that their suffering became a national legend. Basil takes the throne in 976, but his reign doesn't really begin until he claws power away from corrupt regents and ambitious generals. He's not the type to strut into a throne room and declare dominance. He builds it brick by brick, body by body, quiet, relentless, unblinking. His style of rule is less about flash and more about inevitability. If you oppose him, he doesn't scream, he just keeps coming, and eventually you run out of time. The Bulgarians are his main obsession. For decades they've challenged Byzantine rule, defying taxation, raiding border towns and refusing to submit. Basil doesn't see this as just rebellion. It's a personal insult, a challenge to his authority. He responds not with treaties but with a campaign of annihilation that lasts over 40 years. Think about that. 40 years of war. 40 years of marching armies, burned villages, starved populations, and slow grinding, imperial vengeance. The most infamous moment comes in 1014 at the Battle of Cleidion. You're there, standing on the hills overlooking a narrow pass where Basil has trapped the Bulgarian army. His generals advise caution. Basil ignores them. He orders a brutal attack, crushing the Bulgarian forces and capturing around 15,000 soldiers in one day. That's not a typo. 15,000. And what does he do with them? Here's your fringe fact, and it's one of the most gruesome moments in medieval warfare. Basil orders the soldiers to be blinded, all of them, every single one. He spares just one eye for every 100th man, so each small group can be led home by a partially sighted companion. Imagine it. Thousands of men stumbling through the mountains, eyes destroyed, clinging to each other in agony, bleeding, screaming. When their Tsar, Samuel of Bulgaria, sees them approaching, he's said to have collapsed on the spot from the shock and died 2 days later. Basil doesn't deny it. He's proud of it. That was the point. This isn't a war crime hidden in the margins. This is a political message written in blood. Basil wants his enemies, and his subjects, to know exactly what happens when you defy the Empire. He doesn't just beat you, he removes your future. But Basil's brutality isn't wild or erratic, it's systematic, controlled. His wars are cold calculations. He reorganises the Byzantine military, slashes aristocratic power, and redistributes land to loyal soldiers, undermining rebellious nobles and reinforcing central authority. He creates a state where loyalty is rewarded, treason is crushed, and fear keeps the machine running smoothly. He doesn't rule through charm, he rules through precision and pressure, and it works. Under Basil's rule, the Byzantine Empire hits its military and territorial peak. Armenia submits, Georgia bows, the Balkans fall into line, trade flourishes, and the empire's borders are more secure than they've been in centuries. To his supporters, Basil is a hero, a savior who restored Byzantine glory. To everyone else, he's a monster in imperial robes. Even within the capital, Constantinople, his presence is unsettling. He rarely attends court ceremonies, avoids flattery, keeps to a tight circle of advisors. He doesn't marry, does not have children. It's as if he's wedded to the empire itself, or maybe he just doesn't trust anyone enough to share the throne or his bed. You see him walking the halls of the palace, draped not in gold but in military garb, eyes sharp, mouth always one word away from an execution order. His paranoia isn't loud, it's efficient. When governors in Asia Minor begin expanding their private armies, he strips their land. When senators murmur about tax burdens, he jails them. He's not chaotic like Ivan the Terrible or petty like King John, he's mechanical. There's no joy in his cruelty, just endless, tireless purpose. Toward the end of his life, Basil begins preparing for his death with the same thoroughness he brought to his wars. He leaves behind no direct heir, but a fully operational administrative machine designed to carry on without him. And when he finally dies in 1025, peacefully in his bed, it's almost anticlimactic. No assassins, no rebellion, no plague, just silence. After 49 years on the throne, the longest of any Byzantine emperor, he simply stops. His tombstone, which he allegedly wrote himself, doesn't mention his imperial titles, his glory, or his religious devotion. It reads like a soldier's epitaph. He was a warrior who saved the empire. That's it. No saints, no grandeur, just blood and steel. Historians still debate how to frame him. Was he a national hero or a national trauma? A military genius or a medieval butcher with a talent for policy? Some see him as the last great Byzantine emperor. Others say he hollowed out the soul of the empire while preserving its skin. You leave the Balkans under a bruised sky. The mountains are still there, so are the rivers. But the villages, the families, the future's Basil crushed, those are ghosts now. And the worst part is, he won. He didn't fall, he didn't lose, he got everything he wanted. That's a special kind of evil, the kind that history struggles to condemn because it left behind too many victories and not enough survivors. You're deep in France now, the air thick with wood smoke and incense, and the towns ring their church bells like nervous hearts trying to keep rhythm. The year is 1328, and the Capetian dynasty has just fizzled out. A new one is rising, the House of Valois, and at its front stands a man who looks more like a wax statue than a king. Philip VI, the first Valois monarch, has thin lips, a calculating stare, and a gift for making very bad things happen by accident, or sometimes not by accident at all. This is the king who watched his kingdom slide into madness, and instead of pulling it back from the brink, he greased the slope. You meet him at the beginning of what would become the 100 Years' War, though no one's calling it that yet. Philip ascends to the throne in a moment of disputed inheritance, because when the last Capetian king dies, his closest male heir isn't French at all. He's Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV through his mother. But Philip VI, cousin to the deceased king, is in France. He's got the army, the nobles, the crown, and in medieval Europe that's usually enough. To secure the throne, Philip leans hard into Salic law, that conveniently patriarchal little doctrine that says no woman, and by extension no son of a woman, can inherit the French crown. It's thin, It's politically motivated, but it sticks. Edward is snubbed, humiliated and pushed aside, and Philip, knowing full well he just played dirty, arms up. War isn't inevitable, but Philip practically carves the road to it in gold. At first, his rule seems stable enough. He hosts lavish ceremonies, doles out land and titles. The court is bloated with pageantry, but you can feel something cracking underneath. Philip isn't just insecure, he's panicked. He starts re-centralising royal power with all the subtlety of a wrecking ball. Nobles are squeezed for taxes, towns are fined for disloyalty, whole provinces, like Flanders, are treated like rebellious teenagers, and when they push back, Philip doesn't listen, he punishes. You see it firsthand during the Battle of Cassel in 1328, when Flemish peasants rise up against their French overlords. Instead of sending negotiators or trying to cool tensions, Philip sends the army. He crushes the rebellion so thoroughly that rebel bodies are stacked like lumber. Over 15,000 are killed or maimed. And afterward, he imposes brutal taxes on the survivors, not because they're dangerous, but because they remind him that he almost lost control. And then comes the real disaster. The war with England. Edward III, still fuming over the whole inheritance fiasco, claims the French throne in 1337. It's bold, reckless, and exactly the kind of challenge Philip can't ignore. What follows is the start of one of the most ruinous conflicts in European history. A war that will burn through monarchs, cities, economies, and entire generations. And Philip? He's the guy who lights the match and throws it into a dry barn. He's not a strong wartime leader. That's the problem. He's slow, indecisive, obsessed with decorum, while Edward rips through towns like a battering ram in royal armour. Philip gathers massive armies but hesitates to use them. His strategy is reactive, not proactive. He loses naval control at Sluys in 1340, fumbles diplomacy with key allies, and then, when the war starts turning into an avalanche, he starts blaming everyone else. You're at court when the finger-pointing begins. His ministers are dismissed, his advisors purged, some are jailed for disloyalty, others executed for incompetence. When Normandy is nearly lost, Philip doesn't accept blame. He orders tax increases to punish the region. Local rebellions break out. And then comes Crécy in 1346, one of the most humiliating defeats in French history. Philip arrives with a massive force, some 30,000 strong, to crush Edward's smaller English army. But the English have longbows, discipline, and a genius for terrain. Philip has pride and poor coordination. The French knights charge repeatedly into mud, arrows, and death. Thousands fall, and instead of rallying them, Philip reportedly flees the field, riding so far and so fast that he earns a mocking nickname, Philip the Fortunate, whispered in irony by the soldiers left behind. And if all that weren't enough, then comes the Black Death. In 1348, the plague hits France like a divine curse. Entire towns vanish. Trade collapses. The population bleeds out through pustules and fever. What does Philip do? Not much. He locks himself away, issues vague religious proclamations, and leaves regional leaders to deal with the chaos. Some try quarantines. Others blame the Jews. Pogroms erupt, and Philip, who could have stopped them with a word, stays silent. That's your fringe fact for tonight. Under Philip's reign, anti-Jewish violence escalated dramatically, with local authorities encouraged, implicitly or explicitly, to purge the cities of unbelievers. Entire communities are burned, drowned, expelled, and while all this unfolds, the economy nosedives. Currency is debased, inflation skyrockets, peasants revolt, towns fall into lawlessness. France, under Philip's guidance, becomes less a kingdom and more a slow-motion implosion. When he dies in 1350, few mourn. He leaves behind a fractured realm, a war that will rage for another century, and a son, John II, who somehow manages to be even worse. The dynasty survives, but just barely. The peasants don't sing songs, the nobles don't build statues, they just move on, bruised and bitter. Historians today are conflicted. Some say Philip was dealt a rough hand, succession crisis, plague, war. Others point out that he made every crisis worse with poor decisions, arrogance, and short-sighted brutality. He ruled with a velvet glove, but only because he didn't know how to wield the iron fist properly. You walk away from Paris under a sky clogged with smoke from 1,000 smouldering hearths. The bells still ring, the cathedrals still stand, but behind every stone is the echo of a misstep, a wrong word, a cruel law, VI wasn't evil because he raged. He was evil because he ignored the fire while sitting on a throne made of kindling. You shift east now into jagged forests and black rivers where the land itself seems to whisper old curses. The map says you're in Wallachia, deep in the shadowy folds of what would one day become Romania. But tonight, names don't matter as much as legends. And here, in this place of ravens and ruins, you're about to meet the most famously cruel monarch of them all, Vlad the III Dracula. Yes, that Dracula, the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Bloodsucker. But let's be clear, the real Vlad doesn't need vampires or fangs to terrify you. His evil is entirely human, and a lot more creative. Born around 1431 in Transylvania, Vlad is the second son of Vlad II Dracul, the Dragon, a member of the Order of the Dragon, a Catholic military fraternity devoted to fighting the Ottomans. His nickname, Dracula, literally means son of the dragon, though later, locals would twist it to mean son of the devil. And honestly, not unfair. Vlad's childhood is already soaked in betrayal. At just 11 years old, he and his younger brother are taken as hostages by the Ottoman Sultan Murad Thabit as leverage to keep their father loyal. You're there in Edirne, the Ottoman capital, when young Vlad is marched into court, wide-eyed, trembling but furious. His brother adapts. Vlad does not. He stews in silence, memorises court etiquette, watches executions with unblinking focus. This isn't education, it's transformation. He's eventually released, but things have changed. His father's been assassinated, his elder brother buried alive by rival boyars. Wallachia is in chaos, and Vlad? He wants his throne and revenge, not in that order. He claws his way into power through alliances, threats, and sheer audacity. His first stint as voivode, prince, is brief, but by 1456 he regains the throne with Hungarian support. That's when the terror begins, because Vlad isn't content to just rule, he wants to cleanse his kingdom of traitors, of corruption, of anyone who looked at him sideways. And his favourite method? Impalement. You hear about it long before you see it. Stories drift like smoke. Nobles impaled on giant stakes, their bodies twitching in the breeze for days. Criminals skewered through the abdomen or anus, their own weight dragging them down the sharpened wood, while Vlad hosts banquets within view. He doesn't just kill, he displays. Punishment becomes spectacle. In 1459 he invites hundreds of local boyars to a grand Easter feast in Targovishta. During the meal he accuses them of treason, mocks their disloyalty, and then arrests every one of them. The old and sick are impaled. The rest? Forced to march in chains to a remote mountain fortress and build it stone by stone, many of them seemingly dying along the way. This is Vlad's justice, equal parts paranoia and performance art. Here's your fringe fact tonight. Vlad once reportedly impaled an entire forest of people, 20,000 Ottoman prisoners according to some sources, turning a field near Targovishta into what became known as the Forest of the Impaled. When the invading Sultan Mehmed II arrived, he took one look at the grotesque display of corpses and turned his army around. That's right, Vlad fought off the most powerful army in the world with nothing but bodies on sticks. And yet, in his mind, none of this was cruelty. It was order. Vlad saw himself as a righteous punisher, a restorer of law and dignity to a land teetering on anarchy. He passed laws against theft, adultery, laziness. Legend says a golden cup sat in a public square during his reign, untouched, because no one dared steal under Vlad's rule. And the thing is, he wasn't wrong about the chaos. Wallachia was a boiling pot of rival factions, foreign invaders, and internal decay. But Vlad didn't fix it with reform. He fixed it with fear. You're there when the Saxon merchants of Brasov push back on his policies. He responds by burning entire villages, impaling thousands, and launching a propaganda war through letters sent to Western leaders. He describes the executions in detail, even boasts about his cruelty. He wants them to be afraid. He wants the world to know. Of course, the mask eventually cracks. His enemies grow too numerous. The Ottomans invade again. The Hungarians grow wary. Even his former allies start distancing themselves. In 1462, Vlad is captured and imprisoned by Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary. You'd think this would break him, but no. He spends 12 years in prison and somehow talks his way out. He marries, has a child, converts, on paper anyway, and in 1476 regains his throne one last time. It doesn't last. Within months, he's ambushed either by the Ottomans or treacherous boyars, no one's sure, and decapitated. His head is sent to Istanbul as proof. His body, supposedly buried at a monastery, is never definitively found, because of course it isn't. So what do historians say? It's complicated. In Romanian folklore, Vlad is a national hero, a protector who fought off foreign domination and restored dignity to a fragmented kingdom. In Western accounts, he's a monster, a barbarian, a cautionary tale of unchecked cruelty. Some scholars even suggest the most gruesome stories were Ottoman propaganda. But here's the catch. Vlad himself never denied them. In fact, he encouraged them. You ride out of Wallachia with your back to a landscape haunted by crows and ash. The sun dips behind the Carpathians, casting long shadows that don't seem to follow the wind. Vlad Dracula wasn't evil because he was bloodthirsty. He was evil because he believed his bloodlust was justice, and in the end, that's the most dangerous kind of tyrant. The one who sleeps soundly at night, convinced the stakes outside his castle make him a saviour. The wind sharpens as you climb into the Alps, snow swirling, like ash in the high passes, carving out your path through icy stone and silence. But it's not the cold that unnerves you. It's the sense of something hollowed out beneath the pageantry, an empire cracking from the top down. You're heading into the Holy Roman Empire during the late 15th century, and your destination is the gilded nightmare of Maximilian Fussin, a man who didn't earn his evil through slaughter alone, but through manipulation, lies, and a suffocating obsession with control. He was a master propagandist, a military experimenter, a chronic overreacher, and the grandfather of even greater tyrants to come. Born in 1459 to Emperor Frederick III and Empress Eleanor of Portugal, Maximilian enters the world already entitled to greatness. But greatness isn't enough for him. You meet him as a teenager, tall, brilliant, absurdly charismatic, with a voice that slides between Latin, German and French like a serpent in velvet. He's not just ambitious, he's theatrical about it. One of his earliest victories comes not on a battlefield, but in the marriage bed. At 19, he weds Mary of Burgundy, heiress to one of the richest territories in Europe. Through this match, he gains not just wealth, but lands that stretch across the Low Countries. But when Mary dies in a riding accident just a few years later, Maximilian doesn't mourn. He locks down her lands, crushes rebellions, and begins spinning himself as both grieving husband and unstoppable ruler. He appoints himself regent of Burgundy on behalf of their son Philip, ignoring local laws, customs and noble rights. The response: riots, revolts, blood. In Ghent, Bruges and other major cities, citizens rise up against his heavy-handed rule. His answer? Executions, suppression, and the invention of a new kind of tyranny, one where legal language is twisted so tightly that oppression starts to look like order. That's your fringe fact tonight. Maximilian is one of the first European rulers to weaponize bureaucracy. He builds a sprawling imperial court filled with secretaries, lawyers, and paper pushers whose job is to outmaneuver opposition through sheer administrative volume. Don't like a noble? Issue 10 contradictory laws and fine him for violating 8. Want a city's wealth? Audit it until it collapses, then claim it for inefficiency. His rule doesn't feel like a sword, it feels like drowning in ink. You walk through courtrooms filled with terrified officials, each more afraid of a typo than a sword blow. Maximilian micromanages justice from hundreds of miles away, creating an empire where he is the only real authority. Even the church can't keep up. He grants bishoprics to friends, overrides papal decisions, and establishes imperial privileges that effectively neuter local clergy. It's all part of the plan, an empire where even a faith is filtered through his desk. But make no mistake, he loves war. He just doesn't always win them. His campaigns in Italy are grand disasters, fueled by bold speeches, over-promised support and wildly underfunded armies. He gets trapped in endless sieges, loses thousands of soldiers, and spends more time negotiating than conquering. Yet he always spins defeat into destiny, turning blunders into legends with the help of poets and painters on his payroll. You witness him commissioning triumphal arches, illuminated manuscripts and elaborate family trees, all filled with battles he didn't win and titles he didn't quite earn. His most famous project? The Triumphal Arch of Maximilian, a woodcut monument so large and lavish it had to be printed on nearly 200 individual sheets. It depicts Maximilian surrounded by gods, saints, kings and conquerors, a masterpiece of propaganda, a lie so beautiful it starts to feel like truth. And then, of course, comes the political matchmaking. No one marries for power quite like Maximilian. His motto might as well be, "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." He arranges dynastic unions that stitch the Habsburg family into the very fabric of Europe. Spain, Hungary, Bohemia, all tied to his line through marriages that seem romantic until you realise each one is a calculated land grab. But here's where the danger sharpens, because through his scheming, Maximilian lays the foundation for an empire that will eventually span the globe, a web of control that his grandson Charles V will inherit and expand. The Habsburgs will rise as Europe's great superpower, their dynasty so tightly interwoven with kingship that breaking them becomes nearly impossible. The seeds of centuries-long conflict planted here by Maximilian, with a wink. By the late 1490s, Maximilian has declared himself Holy Roman Emperor, a title he claims without ever being crowned by the Pope, breaking a tradition nearly 1,000 years old. He justifies it with paperwork and political backing as always, and when Rome protests, he ignores them. He doesn't need permission, he just needs enough signatures. You're there in 1508 when he formally adopts the title Elected Roman Emperor, and everything shifts. It's the start of absolutism in Europe, a turning point where kings stop asking for divine right and start printing it themselves. Maximilian isn't violent like Vlad or theatrical like Caligula, he's something colder, more modern. He's what happens when cruelty hides behind legal codes and family crests. His final years are filled with debt, disease and paranoia. He fears assassination, sleeps in a coffin, travels with his own death shroud. He micromanages his funeral down to the music and coffin design, leaving behind a bizarre legacy of elaborate tombs with no body inside. He dies in 1519, far from glorious, ailing, broke, and hated by many of the nobles he once ruled. And yet the empire he built endures. The lies held. Historians call him a reformer, a unifier, a visionary. Others call him a tyrant in parchment armour. Both are right. Because Maximilian didn't conquer lands, he conquered systems, and the system stayed broken long after he left. You ride away from Austria beneath a sky layered in clouds like sealing wax. Maximilian's world didn't collapse into fire, it calcified into bureaucracy. That's a different kind of evil, the kind that smiles from a balcony while quietly rewriting your rights. The kind that doesn't kill you, but makes sure you can't breathe without asking first. You descend now into the last corridor of medieval darkness, winding through thick pine forests and scorched valleys until you reach the jagged frontiers of Bohemia, now part of the Czech lands, but in the 14th century it's its own tempest of gold, fire, and boiling ambition. Here stands the last king on our journey, a man so steeped in paranoia and grandiosity that he rewrote his entire kingdom around his obsessions. This is Wenceslaus IV, King of Bohemia and Holy Roman Emperor, a ruler who turned madness into policy and governance into vengeance. If the Middle Ages had a patient zero for bureaucratic dysfunction and sadistic chaos, this guy might be it. He's born in 1361, son of Charles IV, one of the most respected Holy Roman Emperors in history. That legacy? It's heavy. Wenceslaus grows up under towering expectations, surrounded by scholars, priests and diplomats who whisper about destiny and divine favour. But instead of becoming the next philosopher king, he turns inward, brooding, impulsive, a little too fond of wine, a little too fond of punishments that don't quite fit the crime. You meet him in the early years of his reign, crowned King of Bohemia, at just 15. The court still reveres his father, and Wenceslaus rides that fading wave of respect like a half-asleep surfer. But almost immediately cracks appear. He fights with the nobility, undermines the church, and becomes obsessed with rooting out perceived betrayal, real or imagined. He swaps seasoned advisors for flatterers, appoints thugs as ministers. His policies, a blur of sudden taxes, land confiscations and erratic law enforcement. And when people push back, he doesn't negotiate. He punishes. One night, in a rage over what he considers slander, he has several members of the Bohemian Council drowned in the Vltava River, their bodies left to bloat in the sun. That's your fringe fact tonight. Wenceslaus didn't invent extrajudicial execution, but he definitely turned it into a recurring Tuesday. And things only spiral further when he's elected King of the Romans, i.e. Emperor in Waiting, in 1376. It's a political win, sure, but Wenceslaus quickly reveals he's not built for pan-European leadership. He neglects imperial duties. ignores rebellions in Italy, misses coronations, alienates every major elector except the ones he pays directly. The imperial cities beg for leadership, for stability, for anything, and Wenceslaus responds by doing exactly nothing. Or worse, sending contradictory orders that cause more damage than silence ever could. At home in Bohemia, his paranoia deepens. He lashes out at the nobility, particularly the influential House of Rosenberg, whom he accuses of treason without evidence. His solution? Arrest their family members, seize their lands. One poor baron is reportedly locked in a dungeon and left without food until his servants sneak bread through the keyhole. This isn't justice, this is an emperor playing dungeon master in real life. Then comes the Janhus affair, a powder keg that Wenceslaus casually kicks down a stairwell. Hus, a Czech theologian and reformer, begins preaching against church corruption, earning huge support among the Bohemian public. Wenceslaus sees an opportunity to weaken church influence in his realm, so he offers Hus protection. But when Rome calls for Hus's arrest, Wenceslaus flip-flops. First he supports Hus, then he condemns him, then he does nothing at all. The result? Chaos, religious violence, political polarisation, and eventually Hus is burned at the stake in 1415, sparking what will become the Hussite Wars, a religious civil war that tears Bohemia apart. And where is Wenceslaus during all this? Mostly drinking, mostly sulking, occasionally issuing proclamations so disconnected from reality they read like medieval fan fiction. At one point, he declares that any noble questioning his authority will have their land seized in the name of royal truth. What is royal truth? No one knows. But peasants start disappearing for saying the wrong thing. Cities barricade themselves out of sheer exhaustion. Even his family gives up on him. His younger brother, Sigismund, stages a political coup with the support of German princes. In 1400, the electors officially depose Wenceslaus as king of the Romans. And does Wenceslaus fight back? Not really. He sulks in Prague, drinks more wine, and accuses his dogs of betrayal. Yes, really. It's recorded that he once had several of his hunting hounds executed for disloyalty during a royal hunt. You can't make this up, and yet despite all of this, Wenceslaus holds on to the Bohemian crown. Somehow, he digs in like a tick, alternating between fits of rage and long stretches of negligent calm. He ignores famine, mishandles plague outbreaks, and even when rebels torch royal property, he's more annoyed than alarmed. He lives in a weird fog of unearned comfort, occasionally rousing himself to order a public hanging before sinking back into bed. He finally dies in 1419, collapsing during a drunken stupor after a heated argument with one of his councillors. Some say it was a stroke, others say poison. Most agree the empire didn't really lose anything that day, it just sighed in relief. His body is placed in the royal crypt, but the damage is done. The Hussite Wars erupt within months, Bohemia burns, and the Holy Roman Empire fractures further, weakened by Wenceslaus' decades of apathy and vindictiveness. Historians are divided, not on whether he was a bad ruler, but on how bad. Some say he was mentally ill, plagued by depression or bipolar disorder, perhaps even schizophrenia. Others see him as a spoiled child who never grew into the weight of his crown. Either way, his reign shows a different kind of evil. Not the knife, not the dungeon, but the shrug. The refusal to care, the willful neglect of an entire kingdom for the sake of wine, ego, and petty revenge. You leave Prague as thunder rolls over the spires. The stones seem tired, the streets cautious. Wenceslaus left no legacy, no victories, no reform, just a vacuum. And vacuums in history don't stay empty, they suck in everything around them, until someone worse arrives to fill the void. So here you are, back at the edge of the dark wood you've wandered for 25 nights, your cloak heavier with the weight of history, and your boots worn down from centuries of royal madness, misrule, and blood-soaked authority. You've travelled from the shadowed corridors of English castles to the execution squares of Bohemia, through plague-ridden valleys, torch-lit battlefields, and ruined palaces where crowns were polished with the sweat and fear of the people below. And now, finally, the fire's burning low. Let's take a breath, and each of these kings ruled with a grip shaped by their fears. Fear of rebellion, fear of weakness, fear of being forgotten. And to silence that fear, they lashed out. With swords, with laws, with policies that turned entire nations into chessboards, and people into pawns. Some, like Vlad, revelled in cruelty and wore it like armour. Others, like Maximilian, hid their tyranny behind law books and golden seals, still more simply let the world crumble while they sipped wine and argued with their dogs. But here's the strange part. Most of them believed they were doing the right thing, or at least necessary things. They thought they were holding the centre, keeping chaos at bay, writing their legacy one signature or slaughter at a time. Maybe that's the darkest twist of all. Evil and power doesn't always know it's evil. Sometimes it thinks it's saving you. And yet through all of it, people endured. They told stories, they rebelled, they survived. Because that's what history really is. Not the lives of kings, but the resilience of everyone forced to live beneath them. For every impaled noble, there was a farmer who kept planting. For every drowned advisor, a widow who taught her children to read. For every ruler who set the world on fire, 1,000 souls who learned how to carry the smoke. So if your head's still spinning from royal insanity, you're not alone, you made it through. You stared into the eyes of medieval power and lived to tell the tale. And maybe now, when you hear stories of kings and saints and golden ages, you'll remember what was left out. The prisons, the burnings, the bureaucratic strangulation hidden behind silk curtains. Time to lie back. Let the past settle like dust. You've walked through empires that bled and burned, through courts where justice wore a blindfold and carried an axe. But the fire's down to embers now, and somewhere outside this room the world is still turning. Sleep well, you've earned it.